Saruman feels the fire before he sees it, climbing the stone of Orthanc like something that has no right to burn cold. A chain wraps twice around a dead tree in Fangorn, and the tree screams anyway. Ents don't run. Tonight, 3 of them do. Somewhere beneath Isengard's pits, a voice like grinding iron says the same 6 words to every Uruk in the trench. Something is coming that doesn't stop. It has no crown, no ring, no council seat. It rides nothing that was born, and it has already decided Saruman is guilty. This is Galaxy Lore Untold, and tonight, Middle-earth meets the one judge Sauron himself never had to answer to. Ghost Rider is in Fangorn, and the White Wizard's ledger is about to come due. Written by Henry Kings. If there's a crossover you need to see next, drop it in the comments. I read every one. Like, subscribe, hit that bell. This fire doesn't go out. The story begins.
The wound in Fangorn's western eaves had been open for 3 days before the trees stopped screaming and started waiting. That was the difference Treebeard noticed first, not the felling itself, though that was bad enough. Bad in a way that sat in his chest like a swallowed stone, but the change in the quality of the forest's grief. Screaming trees still had hope in them. A tree that waited had already decided what it would do about being murdered, and was only choosing the hour. He stood at the ragged edge where old wood gave way to Saruman's clear-cut wasteland, ankle-deep in a drift of sawdust that hadn't existed a season ago, and he watched the fires of Isengard breathe orange against the underside of the clouds. The air here did not smell the way Fangorn was supposed to smell. No wet moss, no black earth, no the slow mineral hush of things that had not been disturbed since the world was younger. It smelled of pitch and hot iron, and something else beneath that. Something that made Treebeard's roots curl instinctively away from the ground he stood on. It smelled like the world was being rendered down. Whom? He said, low, to no one, because Quickbeam had gone quiet beside him an hour ago, and had not started up again. Quickbeam's bark, usually the reddish silver of a young rowan, had gone the color of old ash at the edges nearest the clear cut. He was staring at a stump, one stump among the hundreds, that still had sap weeping slow and dark from its cut face, sticky and black in the moonlight, like a wound too shocked yet to close. They are killing the wood faster than they can burn it, Quickbeam said at last, each word coming slow the way Entish always came slow, but slower even than that, dragged out by something that was not patience. Faster than they need, Fangorn. There is no hunger in it, only appetite. I have counted, Treebeard said. I have been counting for a long while now. There is a reckoning coming, and it will not be small, and it will not be gentle when it comes. But it is not yet time. The Ents do not act in haste. We have learned, over the long years, the cost of haste. Below them, in the ruined ground between the forest's true edge and the smoking pits of Isengard proper, torchlight moved in ragged clusters. Uruk-hai, a full work party of them, 30 or more, moving among the felled trunks with axes and saws, and the particular unhurried cruelty of creatures who have been told this labor is righteous. Their captain walked among them with a coiled whip he did not need to use often. A look from him did most of the work. He was broad through the shoulders, even for an Uruk, a jagged old scar tracing one cheek down into his jaw, a white hand crudely painted across his breastplate. He answered to Ugluk, and Ugluk answered to the tower, and the tower answered to nothing at all, as far as Treebeard had ever been able to determine, except its own hunger. There, Quickbeam said, and his voice had changed. Not louder. Ents rarely got louder, but the pitch beneath it had shifted, like a note played too near the breaking point of an instrument. He was looking past the work party, toward the deep gouge where a particularly old stand of oaks had stood a fortnight before, where their stumps now sat, blackened, half of them already hauled off toward the furnace pits. One still smoldered faintly at its heart, unable to fully die. Treebeard looked and felt something in the deep root memory of himself. A memory older than the felling, older than Saruman, older by ages than the tower he'd once called a good neighbor, recognized the shape of what was happening in the air above that stump. The air was tearing, not burning, not shimmering with heat haze the way air did above the furnace pits. Tearing, the way old cloth tears, a long ragged seam of wrongness opening silently in the space 6 feet above the dead oak's heart, its edges the color of a bruise just starting to yellow, and through it, light, not moonlight, not firelight, a deep, furious orange-white, pulsing like something with a heartbeat. "Whom?" Treebeard said again, and this time it was not idle. He had seen the vergences before, long ago, in the deep past when the world's seams were looser and things sometimes slipped through the gaps between what was and what might have been elsewhere. He had thought those days long closed. He had thought Fangorn's grief, deep as it ran, could not possibly be old enough, deep enough, to tear anything open again. He had been wrong. The forest's pain, 3 days of screaming trees, and before that years of slow encroachment, and before that centuries of being merely watched, merely waited upon, by a wizard who had once seemed a friend, had accumulated into something with weight, something that had found, in the wound of that smoldering stump, a thin place, a door. The Uruk-hai work party had not yet noticed. They were 50 yards off, dragging a trunk toward the pits, their captain barking something short and ugly at a straggler. But Quickbeam had gone rigid, every twig of him motionless, watching the tier widen. "Should we?" Quickbeam began. "Wait," Treebeard said. "Watch first. We have learned the cost of haste." The tier widened another foot, silent, and then the silence broke. It did not come through with a roar, the way Treebeard had half expected of anything that violent-looking. It came through almost gently, the way a man might step down off a high curb, one motion, unhurried, and then it was simply there, standing on the smoldering stump, as though the stump had always been meant to hold it, and the world around it seemed for one long moment to hold its breath. A skeleton, man-shaped, sat astride a black iron machine that had no business existing in any age of the world Treebeard knew. No horse, no cart, nothing with legs, a thing of wheels and chain and dark metal that gleamed wet with reflected firelight, though there was no rain. Its skull burned. Not glowed. Burned. An open flame the color of a smith's forge at full heat, orange shading white at the hottest points around the eye sockets, and the flame did not flicker the way fire should. It held its shape too well, like something more disciplined than any fire had a right to be. Chains crossed the figure's chest and wrapped both fists, and even those seemed to carry a slow inner heat, like iron left too long in a hearth. For 3 full seconds, nothing moved. Not the Uruk-hai, who had not yet turned. Not Quickbeam, who had forgotten how to be anything but still. Not even the fire in the skull, which for that stretch of silence burned steady and did not so much as gutter. Then the skull turned, slow, and looked directly up the slope at the 2 Ents standing at the forest's ragged edge. And Treebeard felt, for the first time in an age of the world long enough that he had stopped expecting to feel it again, something that was not quite fear, and was not quite awe, but sat close kin to both. It did not seem hostile precisely. It seemed to be reading him, the way a man might read the growth rings of a felled tree, to learn its whole life in a glance. Treebeard had the sudden, uncomfortable certainty that the burning thing on the stump knew, in that one look, everything that had been done to this ground. Every tree cut for spite rather than need. Every year of patient waiting turned finally to grief. "You feel it," the thing said. Its voice did not match a human voice, nor an Ent's slow rumble. It was a scraped, graveled thing, like a chain dragged over stone, and it carried under the words a low crackling hum, the sound of a fire settling in a grate. The dying, all of it. That's why I'm here. You are, Treebeard said carefully, testing the ground of the conversation the way he tested any new thing, slowly. Not of this world. No. The fire in its skull brightened fractionally, and somewhere behind Treebeard, in the dark of the true forest, something that might have been wind, stirred the high branches, though there was no wind. I go where the guilty are. Something opened a door here, something old enough and angry enough to reach me. A pause, the flame steadying again. Lot of guilt on this ground. Below, at last, someone in the Uruk work party turned. A shout went up. Short, ugly, more surprise than alarm at first. The kind of sound a creature makes when its mind hasn't caught up to what its eyes are reporting. Then another shout, and this one had fear woven properly into it, and Ugluk's head snapped around from wherever he'd been standing over his laborers, and the whole work party froze in that particular way that prey freezes when it senses, before it understands, that something has changed in the character of the night. The skeleton did not look toward them yet. Its focus remained, for one more breath, on Treebeard. Old one, it said. This your wood? It is, Treebeard said. What is left of it? Then you should probably step back. It turned the machine, no rider's motion that Treebeard could follow, simply intention translating instantly into movement, the iron wheels finding traction on ground too soft and stump-littered for any true wheel, and started down the slope toward the work party, unhurried, the way a man walks toward a debt he intends to collect in full. Ugluk had enough sense, or enough animal instinct, to draw his blade rather than run, and enough authority left in his throat to bark an order that sent a dozen Uruks fanning out with axes and short swords raised, forming the kind of loose defensive line that spoke of real battle experience, even if it had never once faced anything like this. Stand and hold, he roared, in the black speech-flavored Western his kind used among themselves. It's one thing, cut it down. It was, Treebeard thought, watching from the tree line with Quickbeam rigid and silent beside him, a genuinely brave order, given what was riding toward them. He would remember, later, that this was the first mark in Ugluk's favor, that whatever else the captain was, he did not break formation and run, not at first, not until running became the only thing that made any sense at all. The skeleton reached the work party's line without seeming to hurry, and without seeming to slow. The first Uruk to swing at it, a heavy overhand axe stroke, well aimed, the kind of blow that had split skulls before, connected with a sound like metal striking a bell, a bright ringing clang that sent the axe head skittering off at a wrong angle, and the Uruk staggered back, clutching a numbed arm, more shocked than hurt. Bone doesn't cut easy, the thing said, almost conversational, and lashed out with the burning chain wound around its fist. The chain moved faster than anything that size should move, a whip-crack of orange fire tracing an arc through the dark, and it did not merely strike the next nearest Uruk. It wrapped, once, around the creature's raised sword arm, and for one terrible half-second the Uruk's whole arm lit from within, veins of fire tracing up under the skin like the limb had become a lantern, and then the chain snapped back and the Uruk went down screaming, clutching an arm that smoked but, Treebeard noted with genuine surprise, had not been severed. Burned badly, not killed. Interesting, Treebeard thought, in the slow, deep way he thought most things. It could have taken the arm entire. It chose not to. The rest of the work party broke in earnest then. Ugluk's shouted orders fraying into something closer to panic as 3, then 5, then most of the line scattered for the tree line, or the distant lights of Isengard's outer wall, dropping axes and saws in the sawdust. Only Ugluk himself held, blade raised, teeth bared, standing his ground with the particular stubborn fury of a creature who has never once in his life backed down from a fight and does not know how to start now. The skeleton stopped its machine 6 feet from him and regarded him for a long moment, flame steady. "You give the orders," it said. It was not a question. "I give the orders on this ground," Uruk snarled, "under Saruman's word. And no burning skull tells me different." Saruman. The name came out of the thing's throat with something that was almost, not quite, satisfaction. The sound of a name finally confirmed on a list already half-written. That's the one who wanted all this. A gesture. Chained fist sweeping toward the ruined ground. The stumps. The smoke over the furnace pits. Wanted it enough to make it worth this many trees screaming at once. "He is the white wizard of this land," Uruk said. And there was, Treebeard noted with the slow attention he gave to all things, real conviction in it, not merely fear-driven bravado. Wisest of his order. What is done here is done for good reason, and no creature of fire tells. "Save it," the thing said, not unkindly, almost tired. "I don't punish the ones following orders, not tonight. You're not the guilty one, you're just standing closest to him." The flame in its skull guttered once, low, and when it spoke again, the gravel in its voice had gone deeper, colder. "But you can carry a message back up that hill for me. Tell your wizard the debt's come due. Tell him I've read the ground. Tell him I'm coming for the one who ordered it." Uruk did not lower his blade, but something in his stance shifted, the particular recalibration of a soldier recognizing, mid-fight, that the fight in front of him is not the one he thought he'd signed up for. "And if he does not listen, he'll listen," the writer said. "They always listen, right up until they don't. Then it stops being a message." The chain at its fist coiled once, slow, deliberate, a promise rather than a threat. "Go." For a moment it seemed Uruk might refuse purely from pride. Treebeard had seen enough war captains of one kind or another, over the long ages, to recognize the particular stubbornness that got soldiers killed for no gain at all. But some older survival instinct won out, and the Uruk captain backed 2 full steps before turning and breaking into a controlled run toward Isengard's lights, shouting orders to rally what remained of the scattered work party as he went. The rider watched him go, unmoving, until the last of the fleeing Uruks had vanished past the tree-stump wasteland's edge, and into the glow of the furnace pits proper. Then, and only then, did it turn the machine back up the slope, toward the 2 Ents still standing at the true forest's edge. Treebeard did not step back, though every instinct several thousand years deep told him it might be wise. Quickbeam, beside him, had found his voice again, though it came out barely above the pitch of wind through leaves. "You spoke of debts," Treebeard said, when the burning thing had stopped a respectful distance below them, close enough now that its heat reached him in slow waves, not scorching, but present, the way standing near any true fire is present. "You spoke of a reckoning already decided, before you had walked 1 step of this wood, before you had heard a single word from any who dwell in it. That is not how debts are properly weighed, in my long experience of weighing things. I don't need to weigh it," the writer said. "I read it off the ground. Off every ring and every stump you've got scattered down that hill. It's all there. All the years of it." The flame turned, briefly, taking in the ruin below with something that might, in a face capable of expression, have been read as grief of its own particular shape. "I've walked into worse places than this one, but I've rarely seen this much of it done on purpose, by something that used to know better. He was not always as he is now," Treebeard said, slow, and it cost him something to say it. Some old loyalty not yet entirely burned away despite everything. "Saruman was, once, a neighbor I did not distrust." "That's usually how it goes," the writer said. "The ones who fall the worst started somewhere decent. Doesn't change what I do, just makes it heavier." Quickbeam finally spoke, his voice steadier now but still carrying that raw, ash-edged quality it had taken on watching the stumps burn. "What are you? Not of Middle-earth, not of the West, nor the deep places, nor anything the old songs speak of. What manner of thing hunts wizards for the trees they have felled?" The rider was quiet a moment, the fire in its skull settling to something almost contemplative. "Name's Ghost Rider," it said finally. "I don't hunt for the trees exactly. I hunt for what the trees are owed. There's a difference, even if it comes out looking the same in the end." A pause. "Your forest called me. However that works in this place. It called, and I heard it, and here I am." "I don't leave a summons like that," half answered. "And when this reckoning is finished," Treebeard said, "what then? Do you simply vanish back through the door you came by, and leave what remains of this wood to mend itself, or fail to?" "Don't know yet," the rider admitted, and there was something almost like honesty in the admission, a lack of performance that Treebeard, who had spent long centuries learning to read the true weight behind words, found himself inclined to trust more than he expected to. Never really planned that far. "I go where I'm called. I finish what needs finishing, and usually the door's still there when I'm done, one way or another." The flame flared, briefly, brighter. "Tonight, I'm called to Isengard. Tomorrow, maybe I ask you what else this wizard's done, so I know I'm not leaving half a job behind." Far below, deep in the heart of Isengard's black stone tower, a window that had stood dark for the better part of that night flared suddenly with lamplight, and a tall, white-robed figure stepped to the sill and looked out over the smoking pits and the scattered work party streaming back through the gates in disarray. And even at that distance, even through nothing but stone and dark and firelight, Treebeard had the distinct impression that Saruman had felt, in that instant, something reach across the ruined ground toward him, something patient, something certain, something that had already decided, long before it arrived, exactly how this would end. "He knows already," Quickbeam murmured. "Look, he is watching." "Then he has less time than he thinks to prepare for it," Treebeard said, and for the first time in 3 days of counting silent grievances, something that was almost satisfaction settled into the old grain of him. "Rider, if you mean to walk into that tower and find true reckoning, you will want to know what you walk toward. Saruman is no mere man to be burned and be done with. He commands voices that can turn armies against their own captains. And he has, I fear, allies neither of us has yet reckoned into this." "Then tell me," Ghost Rider said, turning the machine fully to face the old Ent, flame steady, patient, listening in the particular way of something that has all the time it needs and none it intends to waste. "Tell me everything this wood remembers. I've got a debt to collect, and I don't like collecting half of it." Above them, through the tear still hanging faint and unclosing in the dark air over the smoldering stump, the last edges of orange light guttered slowly closed, sealing the door behind him. Not gone, Treebeard sensed, merely quiet, waiting, the way the deep places of the world were always waiting for the moment they'd be needed again. Down in the tower, the lamplight in Saruman's window did not move for a long while. Saruman did not sleep that night, though sleep had rarely troubled him in the long years since he had begun his true work in the pits below the tower. He stood instead at the tall window of his chamber atop Orthanc, hands folded behind his back inside the wide sleeves of his robe, and watched the dark line of Fangorn's eaves, the way a man watches a wound he suspects has gone bad beneath the bandage. Something had touched him. He was certain of it, though he could not yet name the shape of what had brushed against the edges of his awareness in the moment the work party's screaming had reached the tower. Not the ordinary panic of laborers fleeing an ordinary danger, wolves or wild men or a stray ant grown finally too angry to be patient any longer. This had carried weight of a different order entirely. It had felt, for one unpleasant instant, like being seen by something that had already finished looking. My lord. Grima's voice came soft from the doorway, the particular hushed register he used at this hour, when the tower's other business was mostly asleep, and only the two of them remained awake to tend it. The captain of the Western work party begs audience, he says. A pause, faint distaste threading through the words. He says he has a message. From a demon. Send him up, Saruman said, without turning from the window. Uruk came into the chamber, still carrying the smell of the felling ground on him, pitch and sweat, and something underneath that Saruman's long-trained senses recognized after a moment as scorched flesh. Not his own, or not much of it. A graze along one forearm, already treated with the rough field dressing the Uruk-hai used among themselves. He did not kneel, which Saruman had long since stopped expecting of him, but he stood at something like attention, and beneath the customary defiance in his stance there was, Saruman noted with genuine interest, an undercurrent he had rarely seen in the captain before. Not fear, quite. Something closer to a soldier's grudging respect for a superior enemy. Report, Saruman said. Uruk gave it plainly, without embellishment, which Saruman appreciated in him, even as he found himself needing to press for details. The Uruk had not thought worth mentioning. The exact look of the thing's fire, whether the chain had struck to kill or merely to wound, the precise words it had used. When Uruk repeated the message, the debt's come due, I'm coming for the one who ordered it, Saruman felt something in his chest go very still and very cold, the particular stillness of a man recalculating every plan he has laid for the coming season in the space of a single breath. It did not attempt to follow you, Saruman said. Not quite a question. No, Lord. It let the work party scatter. Only I remained, and it did not press me, once it had its message said. A pause, and then, with the blunt honesty that was one of the few qualities Saruman genuinely valued in the creature, it could have killed me. It chose the words instead. That is discipline, Saruman murmured, half to himself, turning at last from the window, or judgment withheld for a particular purpose. Neither is the behavior of a mindless thing loosed to burn. Go, rest. Tell no one else what you saw, on pain of the lash. I will not have the garrison's nerve broken by rumor before I understand what we face. Uruk bowed his head, the closest thing to genuine deference Saruman had ever drawn from him, and withdrew. When the door had shut, Grima slid closer, his thin hands working against each other in the nervous habit Saruman had long since learned to read, as anxiety dressed up as attentiveness. My lord, surely this is some trick of the Ents, some illusion conjured to frighten the garrison, nothing more. The trees have hated us since the felling began. It would be no great leap for them to— The Ents do not conjure illusions, Grima, Saruman said, more sharply than he intended, and saw the smaller man flinch back half a step. He softened his tone by force of will. He had learned long ago that Grima served best when handled rather than driven. Whatever walked into that clearing tonight was no trick of moss and root magic. I felt it. Do you understand what I am telling you? I felt it reach toward this tower, the way one feels the heat of a hearth from an adjoining room. That is not the working of Ents. Grima's mouth worked silently for a moment before he found words. Then what, my lord? Saruman moved to the wide table at the chamber's center, where old volumes lay stacked beside newer instruments of his own devising. Brass and glass, things that measured forces most scholars of Middle-earth had long since stopped believing needed measuring. He laid a hand flat on the topmost book, an old Numenorian text on the nature of the straight road, and the thin places where the world's fabric had, in ages past, worn close to breaking. There are tales, he said slowly, old even in Numenor's day, of doors that open where grief pools deep enough and old enough. Not the doors of the Valar's making, not the straight road proper, but lesser tears, accidental, born of anguish rather than design. I had thought such things belonged wholly to the First Age, to Balerian's ruin, to places where the world itself had been wounded past easy healing. His pale eyes moved to the window, to the dark line of Fangorn beyond. It appears I underestimated what 3 days of felling could accomplish, given sufficiently old and sufficiently furious ground to work upon. You believe the wood summoned it. I believe, Saruman said, that something in that forest has grief and fury enough, banked deep enough across an age of patient waiting, to reach across whatever barrier separates our world from elsewhere, and that whatever answered was already, by its own nature, disposed to answer such a call. He tapped the book once, thoughtfully. A spirit of judgment, of retribution specifically bound to guilt. That is what the word debt suggests to me, and what its restraint with the captain confirms. It did not kill an instrument merely following orders. It named the one who gave them. Grima's already pale face lost another shade of color. Then it means to come here. Undoubtedly, Saruman said it with a calm that cost him more than it appeared to, and turned fully to face his counselor, drawing himself up to the full height that had cowed lesser men for decades. Which is precisely why we will not wait idly for it to arrive at our gates like an unannounced guest. Rouse the garrison. Quietly. Grima, I will not have panic before I have prepared them properly. Send word to the outer watchtowers to report anything resembling fire moving without a bearer, and bring me the palantir. My lord, Grima's voice caught with a fear that was for once, not merely performed for effect. Is that wise? If the stone's other master should be looking, I am aware of the risk, Saruman said, cutting him off. Though not unkindly, Grima's caution here, at least, was not baseless. I do not intend to use it long, nor carelessly, but I would know, before this spirit reaches my gate, whether it is known to any power of this world, mine or another's. Ignorance is the one luxury I cannot presently afford. He crossed to the locked chest at the chamber's far wall, worked the old mechanism with hands that did not shake, though something in him, deep down, wanted them to, and lifted free the dark globe that had been both his greatest asset and his growing curse these last years. He did not look forward to what he might have to trade, in glimpses of his own mind, for whatever answers the stone's other keeper might let slip in the exchange. But Saruman the White had not built the power he now commanded by flinching from costly bargains. 3 miles south, in the black warren of tunnels and pits that made up Isengard's true engine, the forges, the breeding vats, the endless labor of Uruk-hai and the broken things that served beneath even them, word of the burning demon had already begun to spread despite Ugluk's silence, the way word always spreads among soldiers who have watched their fellows carried back with fire-blackened wounds and haunted eyes. Grima had underestimated, in his fear for the tower above, how the pits below would take the news. Among the ordinary garrison, the Dunlending mercenaries Saruman had bought with promises of land and plunder, human men from the hill country who had thrown in with Isengard for reasons ranging from genuine grievance against Rohan to simple hunger. The tale grew in the retelling the way fear always does, until by the second watch of the night half the garrison believed a literal servant of some southern hell realm had walked out of the burning trees and put half a company to the torch with a look. Freka, a broad Dunlending sergeant who had fought under Saruman's banner since before the felling of Fangorn's western eaves had even begun, found himself standing watch atop the outer wall that night with 3 younger men, who had clearly not slept, passing a skin of something harsher than wine between them, with hands that were not entirely steady. You saw it, one of them said. A boy, really, no more than 19 summers, who had joined the garrison for the promise of Rohan's stolen pasture land, and had not, until tonight, seriously reckoned with what that promise might cost. Tell it plain, Freka. Not the version Ugluk's lot are spinning to sound braver than they were. I saw what came back through the gate. Freka said, and did not embellish, because he had learned long ago that the plain truth served a frightened man better than a dressed-up horror. 30 men went out to fell trees. 19 came back running, and one of those 19 has burns up his whole right arm, like he'd stuck it straight into a forge. And he wasn't screaming from pain, he was screaming from something else. Fear, maybe, or something closer to awe. He took a long pull from the skin, passed it on. I don't know what it was. But whatever gave that order to Ugluk, walk away, tell your master, I'm coming for him. That's not a beast. Beasts don't send messages. Do you think it's true what the old bookmen used to say, the boy pressed, about Saruman making bargains he shouldn't, down in those pits, that maybe something's finally come to collect? Freka did not answer that directly, because answering it directly, out loud, on a wall he was sworn to guard, was the kind of thing that got a man's tongue cut out in Isengard even in quieter times than these. But he looked south, toward the black bulk of Orthanc rising against the last stars before dawn, and he thought, privately, that the boy's question was not an unreasonable one to be asking. He had signed on with Saruman for land, for plunder, for the promise of a share in Rohan's fall. He had not signed on to stand watch against something that scorched a man's arm from the inside and called it a message rather than an attack. There was a difference, he thought, between the violence of war, which he understood and had made his peace with long ago, and whatever this was, something that judged rather than merely fought, something that had already, apparently, decided how the whole matter would end before it had struck a single true blow. He did not sleep either that night. Few in Isengard did. Deep in Orthanc's upper chamber, Saruman set the palantir upon its stand and laid both hands flat against its cool, dark surface, and for a long moment nothing happened but the ordinary faint stirring of awareness that came with any true use of the stone, the sense of vast distance compressed to nothing, of other minds and other seeing stones scattered across Middle-earth humming faintly at the edge of perception, most dormant, most unused in this age, save the one that mattered. He felt Baradur's attention arrive the way one feels a change in air pressure before a storm. Not sound, not sight, but pressure. A vast patient weight settling against the edges of his mind, and beneath the pressure, faint and cold, the beginning of a question that was not quite spoken so much as implied. The way Sauron's communications through the stone had always been implied rather than stated, forcing Saruman to do the work of translating pressure into meaning. You call. Why? A spirit has entered Fangorn, Saruman said aloud, though he knew the words themselves mattered less than the clarity of the thought behind them. The stone carried intention as much as language, not of this world. It arrived through a tear in the forest's fabric, born, I believe, of grief accumulated past its natural bearing. It has declared intent against Isengard specifically, against myself, by name of deed if not yet of word. The pressure behind his eyes shifted, something that might, in a being capable of such things, have been read as consideration. Then, slow, cold, unmistakable even filtered through the stone's strange compression of thought into something like language. I know this shape of thing, not by name, by kind. Saruman felt something in his chest tighten. You have encountered its like before, old, before your age. A judge that answers grief and guilt both, wherever the door opens wide enough. It does not serve armies. It does not serve thrones. It serves the debt only, and the debt is paid or it is not, and there is no third path it recognizes. Can it be reasoned with? The pressure behind his eyes seemed, for a long moment, almost amused, in the particular cold way that Sauron's communications occasionally carried an emotion that was worse than anger, precisely because it was so rarely bothered to surface at all. You may try. I have not known it to matter greatly, once the debt is named, but its kind does not commonly concern itself with the wars of kings and wizards. That it has come at all, and named you by deed, tells me your felling of that forest has weighed heavier on the scales than you accounted for. Then you offer no aid. I offer this. It is not mine, and it does not answer to me, and I have no cause to spend strength defending a servant's tower against a debt that servant incurred himself. A pause, and Saruman had the distinct and deeply unwelcome sense of being weighed, assessed, found, not wanting precisely, but reduced, some fraction of value quietly subtracted from whatever ledger Sauron kept regarding his usefulness. See that it does not become my problem, Saruman. I am occupied with larger matters than one white wizard's overreach in a forest that was never worth this much trouble to clear. The pressure withdrew, not abruptly but with the particular deliberate slowness of something making clear it could have withdrawn abruptly, and chose the slower way instead, as a further small assertion of who held the greater strength in the exchange. Saruman lifted his hands from the stone at last and found them, despite his best effort at composure, faintly trembling. He stood a long while in the cold pre-dawn chamber, alone, turning over what he had learned. No aid from Mordor. That, at least, he had half expected, and had not truly hoped for better. But the confirmation that this thing was known, ancient, a kind rather than a singular anomaly, and that even Sauron himself, who feared vanishingly little in the world he intended to rule, spoke of it with something bordering on caution, that reshaped the whole calculus of what Saruman now faced. He crossed back to the window. Dawn was beginning to gray the eastern sky beyond Fangorn's black silhouette, and the forest sat in that gray light like a wound that had, sometime in the night, stopped merely bleeding and started actively fighting back. "Grima," he said, without turning. "My lord, send riders to Dunland. I want every mercenary company still owed coin to be reminded, forcefully, of exactly how much they are owed, and exactly what will happen to that promise, should Isengard fall to a thing neither Rohan nor Mordor will trouble themselves to help against. Fear is a fine recruiting tool, when handled properly." He paused, and something colder and more calculating settled into his expression, the look of a man beginning, despite the fear still coiled beneath his composure, to see the shape of a plan, and send word to the pits. "I want to know precisely what fire-resistant materials remain from the old alchemical stores. If this thing burns, then perhaps it can also be contained. I did not spend years learning the deep arts of this tower, merely to be judged and found wanting by something that has not even troubled itself to properly introduce its purpose. And if containment fails, my lord?" Saruman's pale eyes did not leave the darkening line of Fangorn's trees. "Then we will discover, Grima, whether the white wizard of this world is truly so easily collected upon as a debt in a ledger." His voice had gone very quiet, very even, the tone he used only when he had fully committed himself to a course, and would not be moved from it by any further doubt. "I built Isengard's power from nothing but patience and will. I do not intend to surrender it to a spirit that has not even bothered to learn my name before condemning me." Behind him, unspoken, sat the one truth he had not permitted himself to examine too closely in the stone's cold light, that some deep, unwelcome part of him recognized the shape of the debt being named, and knew, whatever defenses he built in the coming days, that it was not entirely undeserved. Dawn came gray and reluctant over Fangorn, the kind of light that seemed to apologize for existing at all in a place so recently scorched, and Treebeard spent the first hours of it doing what he did best, walking, slow and deliberate, through the wounded eaves of his forest with Ghost Rider's machine rolling silent beside him, and telling him everything the wood remembered. It was not a short telling. Ents did not tell short tellings of anything, and Treebeard had, in truth, been waiting a very long while, years by the reckoning of quicker folk, for someone with both the patience and the power to actually hear the whole of it. He spoke of the years before the felling, when Saruman had walked these same eaves as a guest rather than a despoiler, asking questions of the deep places with what had seemed, at the time, like genuine wonder rather than the extractive hunger it had since revealed itself to be. He spoke of the slow encroachment that had followed. A tree here, a stand there, always with some plausible reason, always just enough to not yet constitute an act of open war. And he spoke, at last and at greatest length, of the 3 days just past. The clear-cutting proper, the furnaces fed faster than Isengard's own forges strictly required, the particular wasteful cruelty of trees felled and left to rot rather than put to any use at all, as though the felling itself, not the wood it produced, had become the point. Ghost Rider listened to all of it without interruption, the fire in his skull burning low and steady, the particular stillness of something that had heard many such tellings before and had learned, across however many debts collected in however many worlds, the value of letting the aggrieved finish their full account before judgment moved to action. He didn't need this much, Ghost Rider said finally, when Treebeard's telling had wound down into a long silence broken only by the distant creak of the true forest settling around them. That's the part that always tips it, in my experience. Need. I've seen plenty. Men do terrible things because they're afraid, or starving, or out of better options. This, the flame gestured, taking in the ravaged clear-cut spreading below them toward Isengard's smoking pits. This is past need. This is a man who liked what the burning let him become. He believes it necessary, Treebeard said, with the particular careful fairness that seemed, Ghost Rider was coming to understand, simply built into the old ant's nature. He would tell you, were you to ask him plainly, that he arms against a war he believes is coming regardless, and that the wood is merely the price of readiness. I do not say he is right. I say only that he believes it, and has perhaps believed it long enough, that the belief and the appetite beneath it have become difficult, even for him, to tell apart. Doesn't matter what he believes, Ghost Rider said, and there was no cruelty in it, only the flat certainty of something reciting a rule it had lived by for longer than it could properly remember not living by. I don't judge belief, I judge the ledger, and the ledger doesn't care why a man did what he did, only that he did it, with his eyes open, knowing better. They had reached, by this point in the long walk, a rise near the forest's southernmost eave, close enough now that Isengard's black tower rose clearly against the pale morning sky, ringed by its smoking pits, and the concentric defensive works Saruman had raised in recent years. Walls within walls, a fortress built by a mind that had clearly, at some point, stopped trusting entirely in strength alone, and begun planning also for siege. It was here that the horn sounded, not from Isengard. The sound came from the north and east, carried on the cold morning wind, a long, clear note that Treebeard recognized after a moment's consideration as neither Rohan's war horns nor anything of Isengard's usual signaling. It was older in its phrasing, cleaner, the kind of horn call meant to travel far and announce something other than immediate battle. "Riders," Treebeard said, turning his great slow head toward the sound, coming down out of the northern vales. Rohirrim, by the sound of the call, though not, I think, riding in war array. That is a herald's note, not a charge. Ghost Rider's flame flickered, a fraction brighter, attentive. Rohan. That's the horse people, the ones fighting Saruman's Uruk-hai already. Fighting them in the field, yes, and losing ground more often than not of late, for all their courage, Treebeard said. Theoden King has been ill-counseled these past seasons, not, I think, entirely of his own choosing, though that is a longer telling than we have time for now. His nephew, Eomer, rides often near these borders on his own authority, watching for orc raids out of Isengard's reach. It would not surprise me greatly if it is he who approaches. They watch together, Ghost Rider's machine idling with a low, patient rumble that seemed, in the morning quiet, almost companionable, as a company of riders came into view along the ridgeline to the north, perhaps a dozen, mounted on tall gray and chestnut horses, spears held upright rather than leveled, banners bearing the white horse of Rohan on green snapping in the cold wind. At their head rode a broad-shouldered man in mail, fair-haired beneath a horsehair-crested helm, his posture the particular alert wariness of a commander who had learned, through hard recent experience, not to ride carelessly anywhere near Isengard's borders. The company drew rein at a cautious distance, close enough to call across, but not so close as to be easily rushed, and their leader raised a hand for a long, appraising study of the burning figure and iron machine standing beside an ent at the forest's edge, before he called out, his voice carrying clear and wary across the intervening ground. "Name yourself. I've had reports through the night of fire loose in these woods, and I'll know what I'm looking at before I ride closer." "Eomer, son of Eomund," Treebeard called back, his great voice rolling easily across the distance in a way that seemed to genuinely startle several of the younger riders. "You need not fear this one, though I will grant he is a fearsome sight to come upon of a gray morning. He has business with the tower yonder, not with Rohan." Eomer's eyes did not leave Ghost Rider, even as he addressed Treebeard, the particular controlled focus of a man who had survived this long by never fully trusting a reassurance he could not personally verify. "Fangorn does not commonly vouch for strangers, old one. Forgive me if I ask him to speak for himself." "Fair enough," Ghost Rider said, and the low gravel of his voice carried its own kind of weight across the distance, enough that several of the younger riders' horses shifted uneasily beneath them. "Name's Ghost Rider. I'm not here for Rohan. I'm here for Saruman, for what he's done to this wood, and I suspect for a fair bit more besides, once I've had the chance to look closer." A pause. The flame steady. Almost, Treebeard thought, deliberately non-threatening in its stillness. "You've been losing ground to his Uruk-hai. I don't imagine you'd shed many tears if that stopped being a problem." Eomer's jaw worked for a moment, weighing the offer implicit in the words against a lifetime of hard-won caution regarding things that arrived promising easy solutions to hard problems. "And what would you want in trade for such a service? Nothing in this world comes free, in my experience, least of all from something that speaks of fire and judgment in the same breath as an ant's grievance. Nothing from Rohan," Ghost Rider said. "This isn't a trade. I don't fight for kingdoms, and I don't collect payment from the people I'm not here to punish. I go where I'm called. I finish what needs finishing. I leave." He paused, and something in the set of the burning skull shifted, a fraction, toward what might, in a face capable of it, have read as genuine consideration. "Though if your king's counsel is as poisoned as this old tree seems to think, that might be worth looking into, once Isengard's settled. Not my main business, but I don't like leaving a job half-finished. And if something's still rotten in your halls after Saruman's dealt with, that rot's not going to just cure itself." The mention of poisoned counsel visibly struck something in Eomer. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, the wariness in his expression gave way to something rawer, closer to old frustrated grief. "You know something of Grima Wormtongue's whisperings in my uncle's ear, then?" "More than I've managed to prove, in any case, for all I've suspected it a long while. I know what the ground tells me," Ghost Rider said, "and I know a man like Saruman doesn't work alone. Somebody's been carrying his words into places he can't reach directly. That's usually how it goes." Eomer studied the burning figure a long moment more, and something in his stance eased, fractionally. Not full trust, Treebeard judged, watching with the patient attention he brought to all things, but the particular provisional acceptance of a soldier, recognizing a possible ally, even through deep uncertainty about the ally's true nature. "I cannot commit Rohan's banner to standing beside a spirit none of us understand," Eomer said at last, carefully, clearly weighing each word before releasing it. "That is not a decision mine to make alone, and my uncle's court is complicated at present, in ways a stranger to this land could not easily be made to understand in a morning's conversation. But I will not stand in your way if your business is truly with Isengard and not with Rohan's people. And I will carry word of what I've seen here back to Edoras, for whatever that report is worth against the council already whispering in the king's ear. That's all I'd ask," Ghostwriter said. "Word travels. Sometimes it matters where it lands." Éomer gave a short nod, the particular economical gesture of a soldier closing a conversation he had extracted what use he could from, and turned his horse's head back toward the north, his company falling in behind him without further ceremony. But before he had ridden more than a few lengths, he drew rein once more and looked back, something more personal than tactical calculation crossing his weathered features. "If you do find yourself in Isengard's heart," he called back, "and Wormtongue is within your reach, know that there are those in Rohan who would count that a debt worth remembering, whatever your own ledger says of it." Then he was gone, the company's hoofbeats fading north along the ridge, and Treebeard let out a long, slow breath that stirred the branches near his shoulders. "That was more courtesy than I expected from the House of Eorl, given present circumstance," the old Ent observed. "Theoden's court has grown suspicious of strangers of late, and not without cause, if the rot Éomer speaks of runs as deep as I suspect." "Everybody's got their own ledger," Ghostwriter said, turning the machine back toward the south, toward Isengard's waiting walls. "His isn't mine to settle, but it's good to know where the lines are drawn, before I ride into the middle of somebody else's war." The flame brightened, a fraction, focus sharpening toward the black tower rising ahead. "Speaking of which, I've heard the Wood's account. I've heard what Rohan's willing to say out loud, and what it's not quite ready to say yet. That's enough groundwork." A low sound, almost like a held breath released, came from somewhere deep in the machine as it began, unhurried, to roll forward down the slope. "Time to go collect." Treebeard watched him go for a long moment, the burning figure and its iron mount growing smaller against the pale morning as it crossed the ravaged clear-cut toward Isengard's outer walls, and found himself, not for the first time in his long life, uncertain whether what he had just set in motion would prove a mercy or merely a different shape of ruin. "Should we follow?" Quickbeam asked quietly, arriving at last from wherever he had lingered through the long telling, his ash-edged bark still carrying the particular stillness of shock not yet fully worn off. "No," Treebeard said, after a long moment's consideration. "This is not our battle to fight, however much satisfaction we might take in its outcome. We have watched, we have told our grievance to one who will act on it, which is more than trees have managed in all the long years before this one." He turned his great slow gaze back toward the ruined ground, toward the smoldering stumps and the tear, still faintly visible if one knew to look for it, hanging quiet in the morning air above the oak that had first opened the door. "But we will watch this ending, Quickbeam, whatever it brings. That much at least, this old wood has earned the right to witness." At Isengard's outer wall, the morning watch had already begun passing word of the approaching figure, not with panic, this time, but with the grim, tight-jawed readiness of soldiers who had spent the whole night preparing for exactly this arrival, whatever preparation against such a thing could possibly amount to. Fricka stood his post near the main gate, sword loosened in its scabbard, though some deep instinct told him plain steel would matter little against what was coming, and watched the burning figure cross the last open ground toward the wall at an unhurried, deliberate pace that somehow unsettled him more than any charge could have. Beside him, the boy from the previous night's watch gripped his spear with white knuckles and did not speak at all. Above them, atop the black tower, Saruman stood once more at his high window, staff in hand now, rather than merely folded behind his back, and watched the debt he had spent 3 days accruing come, at last, unhurried and unafraid, to collect. The gates of Isengard did not open for him. Ghost Rider had not expected them to. He brought the machine to a halt perhaps 40 yards from the outer wall, close enough to feel the particular cold radiating off worked black stone, even through the heat that lived permanently in his own bones, and took the measure of what Saruman had built. It was not a crude thing, this fortress. No simple ring of timber and ditch like the war camps he'd seen in 100 other guilty places across 100 other worlds. This was engineered, layered, a design with real thought behind it. An outer wall studded with murder holes and firing platforms. A dry moat beyond that clearly meant to become wet on short notice. And behind it all, the black ring wall proper, unbroken save for the single gate, with the tower of Orthanc rising sheer and merciless at its center like a blade planted in the earth. A man who builds like this, Ghost Rider thought, has been afraid of something for a long time. Question is whether it was ever really us he was building against, or just the shape of his own guilt he was trying to wall out. Along the battlements, archers had already taken position, Dunlending mercenaries mostly by their dress, with a scattering of Uruk-hai crossbowmen interspersed among them, all of them tracking his approach with the particular tight discipline of soldiers who had been drilled hard through a sleepless night, and told, in no uncertain terms, exactly what would happen to any man who broke and ran before given leave. "That's far enough," a voice called down from the gate tower. Not Saruman's, older, rougher, a captain's voice pitched to carry. "State your business or turn back. We've no quarrel to pick with wandering spirits who keep to their own affairs." "Wasn't planning on keeping to mine," Ghost Rider said, and did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that a voice that didn't need to shout carried its own particular weight. "I've got business with the one who gives you your orders. Send him down, or step aside and let me come to him. Either way works for me." A long pause from the battlements, murmured consultation he could hear even at this distance in the particular way sound carried strangely around him, a gift or a curse, depending on the night, of the fire that lived where a heartbeat should have been. Then, from the high window of the tower itself, a voice answered instead, resonant and deep, and carrying an ease that struck Ghost Rider immediately as deliberate, the practiced calm of something used to being the most persuasive voice in any room it entered. "You have crossed a great distance to stand at my gate, spirit, and I find myself curious what exactly you believe you have come to collect." Saruman had stepped fully into view at the high window now, staff in hand, white robes catching the pale morning light in a way that made him look, deliberately or not, almost luminous against the dark stone behind him. "I am told you named a debt to my captain. I would hear the full accounting before I concern myself with paying it." 3 days of clear-cutting in ancient wood, Ghost Rider said. "Trees felled faster than your furnaces could even burn them. Killed for appetite, not need. The ground told me that much plain enough, and it doesn't lie the way people do." The flame in his skull steadied, focused, the particular stillness that came over him when a target had finally stood still long enough to be properly read. "That's the debt I came for. But standing here looking at what you've built, I get the feeling that's not the whole ledger. Just the part that happened to be loud enough to open a door." Something flickered across Saruman's composed expression. Brief, almost too fast to catch. But Ghost Rider had spent longer than any mortal reckoning of years, learning to read the particular tell of a guilty thing, recognizing itself named correctly. Saruman covered it quickly, folding his free hand behind his back in a gesture of unbothered authority. "You speak as though guilt were a simple thing to weigh," Saruman said, "as though the felling of trees for the arming of a righteous cause were no different from slaughter for its own sake. Do you know, spirit, what stands beyond that eastern horizon? A darkness that has been gathering strength for an age of this world, patient, growing, while lesser powers squabbled over borders and pride. I did not fell that wood from cruelty. I felled it because someone in this world must be strong enough to meet what is coming, and strength, in this age, is bought at a price. I merely chose to pay a price others were too frightened, or too foolish, to countenance. Heard that one before, Ghost Rider said, and there was no heat in it, just the flat weariness of something that genuinely had heard it, 1,000 times, in 1,000 mouths, across 1,000 worlds. Everybody's got a reason that sounds real good from up close. Doesn't change what it looks like from where the wood's standing. You didn't just take what you needed, you took past need, because taking felt like power, and power felt like it made the reason true. A pause, and the chain at his fist coiled once, slow, a gesture more habit than threat. I don't care how good the speech sounds, wizard. I read the rings. Every stump down there told the same story, and none of it was about some darkness in the east. It was about you liking what you'd become while you told yourself the story. For the first time, something genuine cracked through Saruman's composure. Not fear, quite, but a flash of real anger, quick and cold. The particular offense of a man unaccustomed to being seen through so plainly and so quickly by anything, let alone a thing that had not even properly introduced itself before passing judgment. You know nothing of what I have built here, nor what it cost to build it, Saruman said, and his voice had shifted now, dropped into a lower, more resonant register that seemed to carry a subtle pressure behind it, a weight that pressed against the edges of hearing in a way that made even the archers along the wall shift uneasily, unconsciously, in their positions. You are a wandering thing of fire and grievance, summoned by an old tree's self-pity, and you presume to stand at my gate and lecture me on the nature of power. Let me show you, instead, precisely what power in this age of the world is capable of. He raised his staff, and Ghost Rider felt it immediately, the particular texture of the working that gathered around Saruman's upraised hand, ancient and layered, the deep resonant hum of the power that Treebeard had spoken of, the ancient magic of Arda channeled through a mind trained across long centuries in the deep arts of the Astari. It was, Ghost Rider registered with something like genuine professional interest, a formidable thing in its own right, not merely brute force but something more subtle, aimed less at the body and more at the will, a pressure that sought purchase in the mind, the way water sought a crack in stone. It found nothing to hold on to. Ghost Rider felt the working wash over him and through him, and find, at the center of what should have been a mind susceptible to such pressure, only fire and old righteous purpose, nothing soft enough for domination to grip. The voice, for that was clearly what this was, the famous persuasion Saruman was known across Middle-earth for wielding like a blade, simply had nothing in him built the way it needed things built in order to work. He was not flesh weighing a persuasive argument. He was a debt collector's certainty given form, and certainty of that particular vintage did not bend to rhetoric, however ancient or however subtly woven. "That's a good trick," Ghost Rider said, and the flame in his skull brightened, not with anger exactly, but with the particular sharpening focus of something that had just confirmed a useful fact about its opponent. "Bet it's worked on plenty of people who came here with something soft enough to grab onto. I don't have that. Where I come from, that's called a penance stare, and it goes the other direction. I look at what somebody's really done, and they have to see it too, all of it, no story left standing to hide behind." He let the words settle a moment, watching the flicker of something that might have been true alarm cross Saruman's face for the first time. "You want to try that exchange? I'll show you exactly what your debt looks like from the inside, if you're half as curious about it as you pretend not to be." Along the battlements, one of the Uruk-hai crossbowmen, either panicking at the exchange or acting on some order given too quietly for Ghost Rider to have caught, loosed a bolt. It struck him square in the chest, a solid hit, the kind of shot that would have dropped a man in an instant, and the bolt skittered off with the same bright ringing clang the axe had made the night before, leaving nothing behind but a faint scorch mark on leather that had, if anything, only barely noticed the impact. "Right," Ghost Rider said, unbothered, and turned his skull slightly toward the wall where the shot had come from, the flame flaring hotter for a moment in clear, if restrained, irritation. "Steel's not going to do it either. Figured somebody'd try eventually." Saruman's hand came up sharply, a clear order to hold, and the battlements fell still again, though the tension along the wall had ratcheted up several notches, bowstrings still drawn, spears still leveled, every soldier present now fully and viscerally aware that neither blade nor bolt was going to save them if this turned into the fight it seemed determined to become. "Enough," Saruman said, and his voice had regained some measure of its earlier calm, though there was a new wariness threaded beneath it now, the recalibration of a man who had just learned, in real time, that his two most reliable weapons, the voice and simple steel, had both failed at the first true test. "You will not be reasoned with, and you will not be easily destroyed. I confess that presents me with a genuine puzzle, Spirit, one I had not fully anticipated when I began preparing for your arrival." "Good," Ghost Rider said. "Means you're finally being honest instead of talking around it." The machine beneath him gave a low, patient rumble, iron wheels shifting in the dirt though he had not moved. "Here's how this goes, wizard. You come out. You face what you've done. Plain. No more speeches about darkness in the east or prices worth paying. And we settle this the way debts get settled. Clean or not clean, depending on how much you're willing to actually own of what you did. And if I decline that generous invitation, then I come in," Ghost Rider said, simply, "and it stops being a conversation." Saruman studied him a long moment from the high window, the calculation behind his pale eyes almost visible even at this distance, and Ghost Rider recognized the particular quality of that silence. Not surrender, not yet, but a mind rapidly discarding options and searching for whatever remained. "You will forgive me," Saruman said at last, "if I decline to simply walk out to meet a fate I have not yet fully measured. I did not build Isengard's strength to surrender it at the first demand of a stranger, however righteous his claim believes itself to be. If you wish to collect your debt, Spirit, you will have to come and take it, and I promise you, whatever else you have learned tonight about steel and persuasion, you have not yet seen the full measure of what this tower commands." He withdrew from the window without further ceremony, and a long horn note sounded from somewhere deep within the fortress, not the wavering panic of the felling ground the night before, but a deliberate, rising signal, the particular controlled note of a garrison being formally called to full war readiness. Along the battlements, more archers appeared, and behind the gate, Ghost Rider could hear the low grinding sound of something heavy being moved into position. A ram, or a gate reinforcement, or perhaps something else entirely. Some device of Saruman's own devising that the old wizard was gambling might succeed where blade and voice had already failed. "All right," Ghost Rider said, mostly to himself, and the fire in his skull rose, steady and building, brightening from orange toward the hotter edge of white that Treebeard had marked the night before, as the color it took when patience finally ran its course. "We'll do it the hard way then." He turned the machine toward the gate, and did not hurry, because he never did, and somewhere behind that black stone wall, 30-some soldiers who had spent a sleepless night preparing for exactly this moment found that no amount of preparation had actually made them ready for the particular unhurried certainty of the thing now beginning, at last, to close the remaining distance. The ram came first, not against the gate, which Ghost Rider had not yet touched, but against him directly, a heavy iron-shod battering device mounted on a wheeled frame and pushed from within the gate by a full team of Uruk-hai straining at its haul ropes, released to roll downhill under its own gathering momentum, the moment the gate cracked open wide enough to loose it. It was, Ghost Rider had to admit, a genuinely clever piece of engineering. Heavier than any siege ram had strict need to be. Its iron head cold-forged and blessed, he could feel as it closed the distance, with some working laid into the metal itself. Not the voice's subtle persuasion, but something cruder and more direct. A ward meant to disrupt rather than merely to strike. He did not dodge it. Dodging had never much suited his particular philosophy of confrontation. The ram struck him square, a genuine impact this time, not the harmless clang of blade or bolt but real force meeting real resistance. And for one long moment, the world narrowed to the grinding shriek of iron against bone that did not break. The wards working crawling cold and unpleasant across whatever passed for his nerves, seeking purchase it could not quite find. The machine beneath him skidded back a full 10 feet, furrowing the churned earth, and Ghost Rider felt something that was almost respect kindle alongside the building fire in his chest. That one actually hurt, he said, to no one in particular, straightening on the machine as the ram's frame splintered against the abrupt stop of him no longer giving ground. "Didn't think you had it in you, wizard." The reply came not from the tower but from Ugluk himself, positioned now at the gate's edge with a fresh company arrayed behind him, blade drawn, expression grim rather than fearful in the particular way of a soldier who had already decided, sometime in the last sleepless night, that this fight was coming whether he wished it or not, and had made his peace with meeting it standing, rather than running twice from the same enemy. "Ward iron," Ugluk called out, not quite boasting, more the flat report of a man laying his cards on the table, because pretense had stopped being useful. Saruman's own working, forged for a purpose he wouldn't name to the rest of us until an hour passed. "There's more where that came from, Spirit. You'll want to know that before you come further. Appreciate the warning," Ghost Rider said, and meant it. There was, buried under everything else he was, a genuine professional respect for an opponent who fought smart rather than merely hard. "Doesn't change why I'm here, though." He came forward again, unhurried, and this time the gate itself opened fully, disgorging not a single ram but a full company of Uruk-hai in ordered ranks, shields locked, spears leveled in the disciplined formation that had made Isengard's forces the terror of Rohan's borderlands these past several seasons. Ugluk walked at their head, and behind the company, visible through the open gate, Ghost Rider could see more of the ward iron stacked and waiting. Chains this time, heavy and cold-worked, clearly meant for binding rather than merely striking. "They mean to hold you," came Ugluk's voice again, closer now, long enough for the wizard to work whatever else he's got waiting. "I won't pretend I know the whole of his plan. I know my part of it. Hold the line. By the hour. Man's honest, at least," Ghost Rider observed, and there was something almost like approval in it. "All right, let's see how long an hour actually takes." The company advanced, and Ghost Rider met them the way he met every guilty ground he'd ever ridden into, not with wasted motion, not with cruelty beyond what the moment required, but with the particular economical violence of something that had done this work more times than any mortal reckoning could properly count. The chain at his fist lashed out, catching the first rank across raised shields, and where it struck, the ward iron in those shields flared with a brief violent light, absorbing what would otherwise have been a scorching wound, the metal groaning under strain but holding. Clever, he thought again, backing the machine a step as 3 spears drove in from the flank, one glancing off ribs that rang like struck iron, another catching him a genuine graze along one forearm that smoked but did not sever. Wizard's been busy. Whole companies kitted for exactly this fight. He did not kill them. That restraint cost him something in the exchange. Every blow pulled shy of the killing measure, every strike of the chain aimed to wound and scatter rather than to end, and against a full company fighting in disciplined formation, Restraint was expensive, in a way that raw destruction would not have been. But the rule held, the way it always held. These were instruments, following orders under a captain who had, in his own rough way, already shown Ghost Rider more honesty than the wizard hiding behind Orthanc's stone walls. The debt was not theirs to pay. Uruk himself pressed the attack with a genuine skill that surprised him. Not the brute simplicity of most Uruk-hai fighters, but something trained, deliberate, probing for whatever weakness a knight's careful thought might have identified in the reports of the first encounter. His blade found the same forearm graze twice more, widening it, and for the first time since crossing over, Ghost Rider felt something that was almost real pain, sharp and immediate, the ward iron's cold working biting deeper than plain steel ever could. "You're better than your men give you credit for," Ghost Rider said, breaking off from the press for a moment, chain coiling back toward his fist. "Genuinely, most captains I've met would have broken by now, one way or another." "I don't break," Uruk said, flat, circling with the wary economy of a fighter who had already taken the measure of what worked and what didn't. "Not to Rohan, not to orcs of lesser breed who'd challenge me, not to whatever you are either, however hot you burn." A pause, a flicker of something almost curious beneath the grim set of his features. "You didn't kill the boy who shot the bolt at you. Didn't kill any of mine. Not truly. Not when you could have a dozen times over already. Why? Told you already. Not your debt." Ghost Rider's flame steadied, and for a moment the fighting itself seemed to pause around them, the company holding formation but not pressing, as though something in the exchange had bought a genuine breath of stillness. "You follow orders. That's not nothing, but it's not the same thing as choosing the cruelty yourself. Your wizard chose it. That's the difference the ledger cares about." Something in Uruk's expression shifted, fractional, unreadable, and for just a moment, Ghost Rider caught the edge of a thought the Uruk captain did not voice. Some private reckoning of his own, buried under years of loyalty to a master whose true nature he was only now, perhaps, beginning to properly weigh. The moment broke as a fresh sound rose from within the walls. Not a horn this time, but something stranger, a low mechanical grinding that Ghost Rider recognized, with the particular grim familiarity of something that had encountered its cousins in 100 other guilty industrial places, as the sound of heavy machinery being brought online. Steam hissed somewhere deep in the pits below Orthanc's foundations, and the ground itself seemed to shudder faintly. "That's not the company's part," Uruk said, and for the first time genuine uncertainty crossed his scarred face, the look of a soldier realizing his own commander had kept something back even from him. "Saruman didn't tell me what waited behind the second gate." The answer came a moment later, as a section of Isengard's inner wall, not the outer gate the company had come through, but a separate opening near the tower's base, mechanically operated on some system of counterweights and chains, ground slowly open, and from the dark tunnel behind it emerged something that made even the disciplined Uruk-hai ranks flinch back half a step, in genuine, unrehearsed alarm. It walked on 4 limbs of black iron, roughly the size and rough shape of a great warhorse, but built entirely of interlocking plate and gearwork, steam venting in short controlled bursts from vents along its spine, and where its head should have been sat instead, a housing of dark, crystal-worked glass, through which a faint, sickly green light pulsed, steady as a heartbeat. Ward iron chains hung coiled along its flanks, ready to be loosed, and its forelimbs ended not in hooves but in heavy clamped jaws of the same cold-forged metal that had lined the company's shields. "That," Ghost Rider said slowly, taking the measure of the thing with something that was, despite everything, genuine surprise, "is new." Saruman's voice carried down from the tower window once more, and this time there was no mistaking the note of satisfaction threaded through it, the particular pleasure of a man revealing a card he had been saving. "You spoke of tricks, spirit, as though you had already seen the full measure of what I command. I did not spend long years mastering the deep arts of Orthanc, and stealing what secrets of craft I could from the ruin of a fallen kingdom's forges, merely to be caught unprepared by a wandering judge with a taste for theater. The mechanical thing shifted its iron weight, crystal eye brightening, and took one heavy, deliberate step forward, the ground shuddering faintly under its tread. I built this against the day Sauron himself might find me wanting. I confess I had not expected to need it quite so soon, nor against quite so unusual an opponent. But need, as I believe I mentioned, has a way of sharpening a man's preparations. Ghost Rider studied the construct a long moment, the fire in his skull settling into something colder, more focused, the particular stillness he wore when a fight had genuinely, finally, become interesting rather than merely necessary. "Ugluk," he said, without looking away from the iron beast now advancing steadily across the churned ground, steam hissing, jaws working with a low grinding hunger. "Pull your men back. This next part isn't going to leave much room for anybody caught standing between us." Ugluk hesitated only a moment, weighing, Ghost Rider suspected, some private calculation of orders against survival, and finding in the end that survival held the greater weight, before barking a sharp command that sent the company falling back in ordered ranks toward the gate, leaving the open ground before Isengard's wall to the two of them alone. The burning judge and the iron beast Saruman had built to prove that even judgment, in this age of the world, might yet be made to bleed. The construct's crystal eye flared, and with a sound like 100 chains released at once, it charged. The iron beast closed the distance faster than its bulk had any right to allow, steam venting in short, violent bursts from its spine as its legs drove hard into the churned earth. And Ghost Rider met it the only way that made sense against something built for exactly this kind of collision. Head on, chain already whipping free of his fist, the machine beneath him surging forward with a low howling roar that seemed to answer something ancient in the fire that lived where his heart should have been. They met in the open ground between the wall and the forest's ragged eave, with a sound like a landslide striking a bell tower, and for one long suspended moment neither gave ground, the beast's iron jaws closing on the chain Ghost Rider had thrown to meet them, sparks showering in a wide, bright arc, the crystal eye flaring sick green as whatever powered the thing strained against the sudden resistance. "Built well," Ghost Rider allowed, wrenching the chain free with a grinding shriek of metal on metal, backing the motorcycle a hard 6 feet as the beast's foreclaw raked past close enough to graze sparks off the machine's front wheel. "Didn't expect that. Most men who go looking for a weapon against something like me just build bigger." "You built smart." "He had all night," came Ugluk's voice, distant now, called from the retreating company's position near the gate, carrying something that was not quite warning and not quite taunt, but sat uneasily between the two. "Whatever else the man is, spirit, he does not build carelessly." The beast came again, faster this time, and Ghost Rider felt the particular cold bite of the ward iron in its jaws as they closed a second time on the trailing edge of his chain, dragging with a strength that made the motorcycle's rear wheel skid sideways through the mud. He answered by driving the machine directly into the beast's flank rather than away from it, an unexpected reversal that caught the crystal-eyed thing mid-turn, and for the first time in the exchange he felt genuine structural give beneath the impact. A seam of iron plating buckling, steam hissing out in a wild, uncontrolled burst where a joint had been forced past its tolerance. It was, he registered with the particular grim satisfaction of a fight finally revealing its true shape, not indestructible. Clever, well-built, dangerous in a way few things he'd faced across however many worlds had managed to be, but built by hands, by craft, by a mind working within the limits of iron and steam and cold-forged ward metal. Not magic in the deep sense Treebeard had warned him of. Engineering. And engineering, whatever its cleverness, had seams. The beast reared back from the impact with a metallic shriek that might, in something capable of pain, have passed for exactly that. And Ghost Rider pressed the advantage, chain lashing again and again at the buckled joint, each strike widening the crack in the plating, steam venting hotter and wilder with every blow, until the crystal eye's sickly green light began to stutter, flickering in a way that suggested whatever force animated the construct was straining hard against damage it had not been built to sustain. From the tower window, Saruman watched with an expression that had, over the course of the fight, shifted by careful degrees from satisfaction, through concern, and now, unmistakably, toward something closer to alarm. His hands gripped the windowsill stone with a tightness that betrayed, for the first time since this confrontation had begun, genuine fear beneath the composed exterior he had worked so hard to maintain. "Grima," he said, low, not turning from the window. "How long until the second construct is ready?" Grima, hovering near the chamber's edge with his hands twisted together in barely suppressed panic, swallowed hard. 2 days at the least, my lord. Perhaps 3. The Forge Masters said the crystal alone required. Then we do not have a second construct, Saruman said, cutting him off, voice tight with the particular controlled fury of a man watching a carefully laid plan collapse faster than he had accounted for. We have the one, and it is losing. Below, the beast made one final desperate lunge, jaws snapping wide in an attempt to close on the motorcycle's front wheel directly, and Ghost Rider met it by driving the chain straight into the widening crack along its flank, past the buckled plating, and into whatever mechanism lay beneath, and felt the thing's whole iron frame shudder with a violence that spoke of something essential finally giving way. The crystal eye flared once, brilliant, desperate, and then went dark, and the beast's 4 legs folded beneath it in a collapsing cascade of steam and grinding metal, its full weight coming down into the churned mud, with a final shuddering groan that seemed to echo, for a long moment, off the black stone of the wall above. Silence settled over the field. Even the wind seemed to have paused to take stock of what remained. Ghost Rider sat astride the motorcycle amid the wreckage, chain coiling slow back around his fist, and looked up at the tower window where Saruman still stood, composure visibly fraying now, one hand white-knuckled on the stone sill. "That's the second trick," Ghost Rider said, and his voice carried easily across the sudden stillness. No need to raise it. Voice didn't work. Steel didn't work. Now the Iron Beast's down too. You're running out of ways to make this a conversation instead of a collection, wizard. Saruman did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice had lost the earlier resonant confidence, replaced by something harder-edged, more brittle, the sound of a man recalculating his entire strategy in real time and not liking any of the options the recalculation was offering him. "You are persistent," he said. "I will grant you that much. Persistent, and evidently more capable than I had accounted for when I began these preparations." A pause, and something in his tone shifted, cooling further, calculation replacing the earlier bravado. "But persistence alone does not win a siege, Spirit. I have held this tower against greater threats than a wandering judge with a taste for burning what stands in his way. I have time, I have walls, and I have, still, resources you have not yet forced me to spend." "Then spend them," Ghost Rider said, simply, and turned the machine to face the gate once more, unhurried, patient. The particular stillness of something that had all the time in whatever world it currently occupied, and none of the fear the wizard was clearly hoping to provoke. "I'm not going anywhere until this is settled. Doesn't matter how many tricks you've got left in that tower. I'll work through every one of them if that's what it takes." Behind the gate, murmurs rippled through the reassembling company, and Ugluk, standing at their head, found himself studying the wreckage of the fallen construct with an expression that had shifted. Somewhere in the course of the last hour, from grim professional duty into something more complicated, the particular unsettled reckoning of a soldier beginning to genuinely wonder, for the first time in a long career of unquestioning service, whether the master he had sworn himself to was worth the debt now closing in around Isengard's walls. He said nothing of it aloud, not yet, but the seed had been planted, and seeds, in ground as old and patient as this one, had a way of taking root regardless of how carefully a man tried to keep them buried. Above, in the tower's high chamber, Saruman turned from the window at last and crossed to the locked cabinet where his oldest and most dangerous instruments were kept. Things he had hoped never to need, things whose use carried costs he had, until this morning, been unwilling to countenance paying. "Grima," he said, quiet now, the fear beneath his composure no longer fully hidden. "Fetch the black chest, the one from the lower vault. It seems the hour has come to discover whether some prices are worth paying after all." The black chest had not been opened in 11 years. Grima knew this precisely, because he had been the one to carry it down into the lower vault himself, in the early days of Saruman's turn toward Isengard's true purpose, back when the wizard had still spoken occasionally of restraint, of lines he would not cross even in service of the great work ahead. He had watched his master seal the thing with wards of his own devising, and had not asked what lay inside, because there had been, even then, a particular quality to Saruman's silence on the matter that discouraged questions. He carried it up the long spiral stair now with hands that would not quite stop trembling, the chest heavier than its size should have allowed, and set it on the table in the high chamber with the deep, unsteady breath of a man setting down something he half suspected might be safer left unopened. Saruman broke the wards with 3 words in a tongue Grima did not recognize, old and cold and faintly unpleasant to hear spoken aloud, and lifted the lid. Inside, nested in dark velvet gone slightly gray with age, sat a narrow circlet of black iron, unadorned save for a single dull red stone set at its brow, and beside it, coiled like a sleeping thing, a length of chain forged not from ordinary metal, but from something that seemed, even at rest, to drink the light from the room around it. "What is it?" Grima asked, though some deep instinct told him he did not truly want the answer. "A working I acquired long ago, from a source I have never spoken of, and do not intend to begin now," Saruman said, lifting the circlet with careful, almost reverent hands. "Bound domination, older even than the craft of the rings, not the persuasion of the voice, which this creature has already proven immune to, but something more direct. Compulsion laid straight upon whatever passes for its will, bypassing argument entirely." He turned the circlet over once, studying the dull red stone. "I had hoped never to need it. Its cost is not small." "What cost, my lord?" Saruman did not answer immediately, and when he did, his voice had gone quieter, more careful, the tone of a man choosing to reveal only the portion of a truth that served the moment. "It draws upon the wielder as much as the target. I will not lie to you and say this will cost me nothing, Grima, but I have weighed the alternative. This creature loose in Isengard's heart, its judgment already rendered before it ever properly heard my case, and I find the price acceptable." He crossed back to the window, circlet in hand, and looked down at the burning figure still waiting, patient and unhurried, in the churned ground before the gate. "One more attempt at reason first," Saruman murmured, mostly to himself. "I did not become what I am by reaching immediately for the harshest tool available. But I confess, Spirit, you have left me precious few gentler ones to try." Below, Ghost Rider felt the shift in the air before Saruman's voice carried down again, a different quality to the working now gathering in the tower above, colder than the voice's persuasive pressure, sharper edged, something that reminded him uncomfortably of certain older and more directly hostile forces he'd crossed paths with in darker corners of other worlds. "Spirit," Saruman called down, and his tone had changed too, gentler now, almost conciliatory, though Ghost Rider had long since learned to distrust gentleness that arrived precisely when force had already failed twice. "Before this goes further, I would ask you to consider, truly consider, what you believe you are accomplishing here. You judge me for the wood I have felled. Have you asked yourself what stands to be lost? Should Isengard fall before it is ready to meet what comes from the east? Have you weighed the cost of your judgment against the cost of my unreadiness? Should Sauron's armies march before Rohan and Gondor have any strength gathered to meet them?" "Already told you," Ghost Rider said. "I don't weigh maybes. I weigh what's already been done. You want credit for a war that hasn't happened yet. You can settle that account with whoever judges maybes. Not my department." "A pity," Saruman said, and something in his voice had gone colder still, all pretense of conciliation dropping away at once. "I had hoped to resolve this without further unpleasantness. It appears you leave me no gentler option." He raised the black circlet, and the working within it uncoiled, not toward Ghost Rider's mind, which he had already proven held nothing soft enough to seize, but wider, broader, a net cast across the whole field rather than a blade aimed at a single point. Ghost Rider felt it pass through him without purchase, exactly as the voice had, but a half-second later he registered, with a cold professional alarm that had nothing to do with fear for himself, precisely where the working had actually found something to grip. Along the battlements, the archers who had held their positions through the long confrontation went suddenly, uniformly rigid, eyes gone glassy and distant, bows rising in unison to a single silent command that had bypassed every one of their individual wills entirely. Behind the gate, the reassembled company shifted as one, weapons lifting, the whole formation moving with the eerie synchronized precision of puppets rather than soldiers. "There," Saruman said, and something in his voice now carried a note of genuine, unpleasant triumph. "If your will cannot be bent, Spirit, then I shall simply bend every will around you instead, and let you choose whether you are willing to burn through my own people to reach me. I wonder how that sits against your precious ledger." Ghost Rider went very still. He had faced this particular trap before, in other guilty places, other ages. The coward's final gambit, turning the innocent into the shield, forcing judgment to choose between mercy and completion. It never stopped being ugly. It never stopped being, in its own particular way, the clearest proof yet of exactly how far a guilty man would go, rather than simply stand and answer for what he'd done. "Ugluk," he called out, low, steady, watching the captain's own eyes glaze over even as he spoke, the man's body beginning, against whatever remained of his will, to raise his blade toward a company mate, rather than toward the enemy at the gate. "Fight it. You said you don't break. Now's the time to prove that wasn't just talk." Whether it was the words themselves, or some deeper reserve of will the Uruk captain genuinely possessed, Ghost Rider watched Ugluk's raised arm tremble, the glassy compulsion in his eyes flickering, straining against something that pushed back from beneath it. Not enough to fully break the working, not yet, but enough to slow the blade's descent by a critical fraction of a second. It was enough of an opening. Ghost Rider moved the chain not toward any soldier, but up, toward the tower itself, a single vast arcing throw that covered the full distance between the field and the high window in the space of a breath, and the burning length of it caught Saruman's raised arm, the one holding the circlet, in a grip that scorched through white sleeve and pale skin both. The wizard's cry of pain and shock carried clear across the whole field, and the working shattered instantly, every soldier along the wall and behind the gate collapsing to their knees in the ragged, disoriented aftermath of a compulsion suddenly and violently severed, gasping, several of them retching, all of them blinking back into themselves with the particular horror of men realizing, in the space of a few heartbeats, exactly what they had nearly been made to do to their own. "Don't," Ghost Rider said, and the word carried down from the field with a weight that needed no volume behind it at all. "Use them again. That's the last warning you get on that particular trick." Saruman clutched his burned arm against his chest, the black circlet fallen and rolling forgotten across the chamber floor, and for the first time since the confrontation had begun, real, unguarded fear showed plainly on his face, no composure left to hide it behind. Below, Uruk knelt in the churned mud amid his disoriented company, staring up at his own tower with an expression that had gone, in the space of a single working, from grim loyalty to something far colder and far more final. "He was going to make me kill my own men," the captain said, quiet, mostly to himself, though the words carried in the stunned silence to everyone near enough to hear them. "Not command me to. Make me. Whatever oath I swore him, that was never part of it." He rose slowly, blade still in hand, but the grip on it had changed, and when he looked toward the tower window again, there was nothing left in his expression that resembled loyalty at all. The company did not immediately break ranks. Old discipline held that much, even in the aftermath of what had nearly happened. But something fundamental had shifted in the ground beneath Isengard's authority, and everyone present, from the youngest Dunlending spearman to Uruk himself, seemed to feel the change settle over the field like a dropped temperature. Frika, still on the wall where he had watched the whole exchange unfold, found his sword hand had gone slack at his side sometime during the compulsion's brief hold over him, and it took him a long moment, kneeling now among his fellow archers in the aftermath, to fully process what he had nearly been made to do. Bow raised, arrow knocked, aimed not at the burning stranger in the field, but at the back of a man 3 positions down the wall who had, until moments ago, been merely a comrade rather than a target. "He'd have had us killing each other," the young spearman beside him said, voice shaking badly, "and we wouldn't even have known it was happening. Just gone. Puppets." "Aye," Freka said, and found he had no better words for it than that. Below, in the open ground, Ghost Rider had not moved from where the throw had landed, chain still smoking faintly where it had made contact with Saruman's arm, and he watched the visible unraveling of Isengard's discipline with the particular grim attention of something that had seen this exact moment play out before, in other places, under other guilty roofs, the point where fear of the enemy outside finally gave way to something more dangerous for a tyrant, fear of what their own master had already proven willing to do to them. "Captain," he said, addressing Uruk directly now, the two of them separated by perhaps 30 feet of churned mud and scattered, kneeling soldiers. "That's twice now you've shown more restraint than the man giving your orders, first with the message, now with this." He paused, weighing something. "I told you before, I don't collect from instruments, but instruments get to choose, eventually, whether they stay instruments." Uruk did not answer immediately. He looked instead toward the tower window, where Saruman had withdrawn from view, still clutching his burned arm, and something in the captain's scarred face worked through a calculation that had, until this morning, never seriously needed making. "I swore an oath to Isengard," he said finally, slow, testing the words as he spoke them, "not to be made a weapon against my own company by a working I never consented to carry." He looked back toward Ghost Rider, and his grip on his blade shifted again, not toward attack now, but toward something closer to a soldier setting down a burden he had carried too long without examining its true weight. "I do not know what that makes me, in your ledger spirit. I do not ask for mercy I have not earned, but I will tell you plainly, I am done fighting on his behalf, this hour and this day, whatever comes of that." Behind him, A ragged murmur moved through the kneeling company. Not quite agreement, not yet, but the particular uncertain stirring of soldiers hearing their captain voice, a thought several of them had already, privately, begun to think themselves. From the wall, Freke rose slowly to his feet, and after a moment's hesitation, deliberately lowered his bow and set it down against the stone, an unmistakable gesture even from that distance. "I didn't sign on to be made a puppet neither," he called down, his voice carrying rough but clear across the field. "Land and plunder, that I understood. This," he gestured toward the wall, toward the whole shaken company below. "This wasn't in the bargain." More bows lowered along the battlements, not all at once, but in a spreading ripple that Ghost Rider watched with the particular satisfaction of something that had, without quite intending it, achieved exactly the outcome the Wood's grief had originally called him here to serve. Not merely a single wizard's fall, but the slow unraveling of the fear and coercion that had held this whole fortress's true loyalty hostage far longer than 3 days of felled trees could account for. Ghost Rider turned the machine to face the gate fully now, unhurried as ever, but the fire in his skull had settled into something colder, more focused, the particular stillness of a debt finally closing on its last, unshielded page. "Your captain's made his choice," he called up toward the tower, though Saruman had not reappeared at the window. "Your archers are laying down their bows, companies kneeling in the mud instead of fighting for you. That's not me breaking your walls, wizard. That's what's left when everybody around you finally gets a good clear look at exactly what you're willing to do to hold on to what you built." Silence answered him from the tower for a long moment. Long enough that Ghost Rider began to wonder if Saruman had retreated further into Orthanc's depth entirely, seeking some deeper vault, some older working still unspent. Then the voice came again, and it had lost, at last, every trace of the earlier commanding resonance, reduced now to something raw and unguarded, and, for the very first time since this confrontation had begun at dawn, genuinely afraid. "You would have me stand alone then," Saruman said, "abandoned by my own garrison, and face whatever judgment you have already decided to render, with no more recourse left to spend." "That's usually how it ends," Ghost Rider said, not unkindly, "for the ones who spent everybody else's loyalty like it was free." He began to move the machine forward, toward the gate, toward the tower rising black and now unguarded beyond it. And behind him, in the churned mud of the field, Ugluk watched him go with an expression that had settled, finally, into something like grim, complicated peace, the particular quiet of a soldier who had, after a long career of unquestioning service, found at last a line even he would not cross, and had crossed back over it in time. "Rider," Ugluk called after him, and Ghost Rider paused, glancing back. Whatever waits for him in that tower, I'd not weep to hear it was final, but I'd ask, all the same, that you leave something behind when it's done. This company will need someone to answer to once the reckoning's finished, and it had better not be another tyrant wearing a different face." Ghost Rider considered that a long moment, the fire in his skull settling into something almost thoughtful. "Not really my department, rebuilding what's left after," he said. "But I hear you. I'll think on it, once this part's finished." He turned back toward the gate, toward the tower, toward the last unpaid line in a ledger that had, over the course of one long night and morning, grown considerably heavier than a single Wood's grief had first suggested. "Right now, though, I've got one more conversation to finish." The gate stood open and undefended before him, and beyond it, the tower of Orthanc waited, dark and silent, for the debt it had spent so long refusing to fully acknowledge. The inside of Orthanc was colder than Ghost Rider expected, not the ordinary chill of old stone, but something deeper, a cold that seemed woven into the tower's very foundations, as though the black rock itself had been quarried from some place the sun had never properly reached. He left the machine at the base of the spiral stair. Some instinct told him this next part of the reckoning wanted to be walked, not ridden, the way a man walks up to a gallows rather than being carried. He found Grima Wormtongue 2 turns up the stair, alone, pressed into a shadowed alcove with a dagger held in trembling hands that plainly had no real intention of being used, and the moment Ghost Rider's flame rounded the curve of the stair and fell full upon him, the smaller man's composure broke entirely. "Please," Grima said, and the word came out in a rush, stripped of every ounce of the careful, honeyed cunning Ghost Rider had heard described of him. "Please, I know what you have come for, and I will not pretend I do not deserve some portion of your ledger. But hear me before you judge the whole of it." Ghost Rider stopped, and did not advance further, because something in the raw quality of the plea had caught his attention in a way that the wizard's earlier speeches, however eloquent, had entirely failed to. "Talk," he said, fast. "I served him because I believed, once, that his cause was true," Grima said, the words tumbling faster now, born less of hope than of the particular desperate honesty that comes when a man has run entirely out of other strategies. "And then I served him because I no longer knew how to stop, because he had woven himself into my thinking so thoroughly, over so many years, that I could no longer clearly tell which of my own thoughts were truly mine, and which he had planted there, and left to grow like his poison in Rohan's king. I have done terrible things at his direction, Spirit. I do not deny it. I whispered lies into an old man's ear until his own court thought him mad rather than deceived. I do not ask you to forgive that," his voice cracked, "but I ask you to weigh how much of it was truly chosen, against how much was simply carved into me by a will far stronger than my own, until I no longer had the strength left to refuse it." Ghost Rider was quiet a long moment, the fire in his skull burning low and steady, and this was the part of the work that never got easier, no matter how many worlds, how many guilty grounds, how many pleas he'd heard from men standing in the long shadow of someone else's greater corruption. The ledger did not care about intent, he had told Saruman, plainly, at the gate. But the ledger also was not so crude a thing as to fail to distinguish between a man who chose cruelty freely and a man whose will had been slowly, patiently, deliberately worn down by someone who had made an art of exactly that erosion. "You still had choices," he said finally, not unkindly, but not gently either. "Even worn down, even weakened. I've seen men in worse chains than yours find some sliver of will left to refuse the worst of it, when it mattered enough. You didn't always find that sliver. That's real, and it's yours to carry." He paused, weighing something further. "But I don't burn men for being weak, Wormtongue. I burn them for choosing cruelty when they still had a clear road to something better, and took the crueler path anyway, eyes open. That's not quite your shape, near as I can read it, not the whole of it." Grima's breath came out in something between a sob and a laugh, the sound of a man who had expected only judgment, and found, instead, something far stranger and harder to hold, the possibility of being seen clearly, weighed honestly, and found, if not innocent, then at least understood. "What happens to me then? Not my department, deciding what comes after," Ghost Rider said. "That's between you and whoever you answer to once this is done. Rohan, most like, given what Eomer told me of his own king's suffering under whatever poison you helped pour. You'll answer for what you did. But you'll answer to people, in a court, with a chance to say what you just said to me. That's more than the man upstairs is about to get." He stepped past the alcove, toward the stair's next turn, and paused only once more, glancing back. "Get out of this tower, Grima, while you still can. Whatever's about to happen up there, you don't want to be standing anywhere near it." Grima did not need telling twice. He fled down the spiral stair, dagger clattering forgotten to the stone, and Ghost Rider continued upward alone, the cold deepening with every turn, until at last the stair opened out into the high chamber where Saruman waited. The wizard stood at the room's center now, not at the window, staff planted before him like a last line of defense, his burned arm cradled close against his robes, and the composure that had carried him through the long morning's confrontation had finally, entirely, given way to something rawer and more honest. A man who had run out of tricks, out of soldiers, out of speeches, and stood now facing the thing he had spent the whole night trying every conceivable strategy to avoid facing at all. "You have come to finish it then," Saruman said, and his voice, stripped of the voice's resonant persuasion, sounded older than Ghost Rider had expected, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the burn along his arm. "That's the idea," Ghost Rider said, and stopped a few paces into the chamber, the fire in his skull settling into the particular focused stillness that always preceded this final part of the work. "But I don't just burn, wizard. Not without you seeing it first. Every bit of what you did. Plain. No story left to hide behind. That's the real reckoning. The fire after is just what's left once the seeing's done." Saruman's pale eyes searched his burning skull for a long moment, and something in the old wizard's proud bearing seemed, for the first time, to genuinely waver, not toward fear alone now, but toward something closer to the beginning of real reckoning. The particular dawning horror of a man realizing that the version of events he had told himself, and told Ugluk, and told the whole garrison, and told even Sauron through the cold stone downstairs, might not survive contact with a gaze that judged only what had actually been done. "And if I refuse to let you look?" Saruman asked, though the question came out thinner than he clearly intended it to. "You don't get a vote," Ghost Rider said, and the flame in his skull flared, bright and sudden, orange bleeding fast toward white. "That's not really how this part works." He raised his free hand, and the fire that lived where his face should have been began, for the first time since crossing over into this world, to truly burn. The penance stare, when it came, did not arrive the way Saruman had braced for. He had expected pain, had steeled himself, in the last desperate seconds before the burning gaze fully fixed on him, for something like the ward iron's cold bite, or the raw physical violence of chain and fire he had already witnessed, turned against his soldiers and his construct alike. What came instead was worse, in a way that had nothing to do with the body at all. He saw himself, not as he had told the story to Ugluk, to Grima, to the cold pressure of Sauron's attention through the Palantir, not the wise steward gathering strength against a coming darkness, forced by necessity into hard and unpopular choices. He saw, laid bare and undefended in the burning light of the stair, the actual shape of every choice as it had truly been made. The first tree felled not from strategic need, but from simple curiosity about how much the forest would bear before it began to fight back. The slow escalation, season by season, of taking more than any war preparation genuinely required, because the taking itself had become, somewhere along the way, its own quiet pleasure. The moment, clear as a struck bell, when he had first reached for the voice not to persuade a reluctant ally, but to simply make disagreement impossible, because disagreement had become, by then, an intolerable inconvenience rather than a challenge worth weighing. He saw Grima's slow unraveling under years of patient manipulation, not as a necessary tool wielded in service of a greater cause, but as exactly what it had always been: cruelty dressed in the clothing of strategy, inflicted on a man too weak-willed to resist and too useful to release. He saw Theoden's court, poisoned across long seasons, an old king made to doubt his own mind while the true source of the doubt stood robed in white and called it wisdom. He saw, worst of all, the moment, years past now, buried under so many later justifications, that he had genuinely, almost successfully, forgotten it, when he had first understood exactly what Sauron's growing power in the East truly meant, and had chosen, In that private moment, not fear for Middle-earth's peoples but something closer to envy, a hunger to possess some fraction of that same unchallengeable strength for himself, dressed up ever since in the borrowed language of necessary preparation. Saruman fell to his knees on the cold stone of his own high chamber, and the sound that came out of him was not the composed, resonant voice that had commanded armies and bent kings' counsel for decades. It was something smaller, something that had, perhaps, not been heard from him honestly in a very long time. Ghost Rider held the stare a long moment longer, watching the wizard break under the weight of his own true accounting, and then, and this was the part that never got easier, the part that separated the work from simple cruelty, he let it fade. Saruman knelt, gasping, tears he seemed genuinely startled to find on his own face, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "Now you've seen it," Ghost Rider said finally. "Quiet. All of it. No story left standing between you and what you actually did." "Yes," Saruman said, and his voice came out raw, stripped of every ounce of performance. "I see it. I have told myself a different tale, for so long, that I had nearly forgotten there was another one beneath it." He looked up, and something in his ravaged expression was almost pleading, though Ghost Rider judged it was not mercy he was pleading for. Not exactly. Something closer to understanding. One last attempt to be heard as more than merely the sum of his worst choices. Does the seeing end it then? Is that the whole of your judgment, to force a man to witness his own guilt, and let that suffering stand as payment? Ghost Rider was quiet a long moment, and here, at the true center of the reckoning, he found himself weighing something he had weighed 1,000 times before, in 1,000 other guilty chambers, and had never once found it grew easier for the repetition. The rule was simple, on its surface. The debt was paid, or it was not. He did not usually find much room between those two poles, but he had pulled his blows all morning, with Ugluk's company, with the archers along the wall even, in its way, with Grima on the stair. Not because the rule bent, but because the rule had always, underneath its simplicity, asked him to weigh the true shape of a thing before rendering final judgment upon it. And Saruman, kneeling before him now, was not the same man who had stood composed and resonant at the window hours before, spinning stories of necessary strength against a coming darkness. Something in the stare's seeing had cracked something Ghost Rider suspected had needed cracking for a very long time. That did not erase the wood. It did not erase Theoden's poisoned court, or Grima's slow unmaking, or the genuine appetite for cruelty the stare had laid bare beneath every one of Saruman's careful justifications. But it was, perhaps, not nothing either. "Here's my problem," Ghost Rider said finally, and there was no anger in it now, only the flat weight of a genuine dilemma being weighed in real time. "My whole purpose, every debt I've ever collected, it only works if it's final. If guilt gets seen, and then it gets answered, clean, no half measures, no mercy that lets the next guilty thing think maybe it'll get the same soft landing. That's the whole point. That's what keeps the ledger honest." He paused, the flame in his skull dimming to something almost contemplative. "But I also don't burn a thing just because burning's the easy answer. And I'm looking at you right now, and I'm not entirely sure the fire's the whole of what's actually owed here. Not after what I just watched you see." "Then what is owed?" Saruman asked, and the question came out genuinely uncertain. A man who had spent his whole adult life being the one who decided what was owed to others, now facing, for perhaps the first time, having that judgment rendered upon himself by someone who plainly did not intend to make it easy. Ghost Rider did not answer immediately. Somewhere below, through the tower's thick stone, he could faintly hear the sounds of a garrison, in the slow, uncertain process of deciding what it wanted to become, now that its old fear had finally, visibly, cracked. Ugluk's voice, distant, giving some order that was not a war order. Freka's rougher tone answering it. He thought of Ugluk's request at the gate. Leave something behind when it's done. He thought of the wood, and Treebeard's long, patient telling, and the particular weight of a grievance that had waited so long for someone with the power to actually answer it. And he thought, too, of every world he'd ridden into where the guilty thing had simply burned, clean and total and final, and the ground beneath it had been left exactly as broken as it was before he arrived. The debt paid, technically, by the letter of the ledger, but nothing actually mended in the paying of it. "You're going to live," he said finally, "and watch something complicated. Not relief, not quite. Something closer to a fresh kind of dread. Cross Saruman's ravaged face, but not like this. Not with the tower, not with the voice, not with a staff that can bend a king's counsel, or a construct that can hunt down anything that challenges you. That part of you, the part that decided taking was the same thing as strength. That's the part the fire's going to answer for. What's left after, if anything's left worth keeping, is going to have to actually earn its own way forward, without any of the power you built it on." He raised his hand again, and this time the fire came not as judgment of the whole man, but as something narrower, more surgical, a burning that reached for the staff still gripped, forgotten, in Saruman's trembling hand, and for whatever deep well of the power the wizard had spent decades learning to channel and bend to his own private hungers. The staff ignited from within, white fire consuming ancient wood in a matter of seconds, and Saruman screamed, not the scream of a man burning, but something stranger, deeper, the sound of a well finally being sealed after long years of unrestricted draw. When the fire guttered out, the staff had crumbled to ash in his scorched hand, and something in the wizard's whole bearing had visibly, permanently diminished, the particular unmistakable slump of a man who had just watched the true source of his power extinguished before his own eyes. "That's the debt," Ghostwriter said quietly, into the silence that followed. "Not your life, your power, the thing you used every worse choice to build and protect. It's gone now. What you do with whatever's left of you, that's not mine to collect on. That's yours to answer for, going forward, to whoever you've wronged badly enough that they still want an answer." Saruman knelt amid the ash of his own staff, hollowed and diminished and, for the first time in longer than he could clearly remember, entirely without the power to compel a single soul in that tower to see him as anything other than exactly what he now, finally was. Word of what had happened in the high chamber reached the garrison in pieces, carried down the spiral stair first by a shaken Grima, who had not, in the end, fled as far as he'd intended, and then confirmed more fully when Ghostwriter himself descended, unhurried, the fire in his skull banked low, and found Ugluk waiting near the base of the tower, with the greater part of the company gathered loosely behind him. "He's alive," Ghostwriter said, before Ugluk could ask. "Won't be giving orders through the voice anymore, though. Won't be building any more iron beasts either. Whatever he's got left, he's going to have to earn it back the hard way, same as anybody else." He paused, taking the measure of the gathered soldiers, Uruk-hai and Dunlending both, standing in a loose, uneasy cluster that no longer resembled a disciplined garrison, so much as a crowd of people waiting to learn what came next. "That's not really something I can settle for you, though. That part's yours." Ugluk was quiet a moment, studying the tower above as though seeing it fully for the first time. "What becomes of Isengard, then? Half this company signed for plunder and a share of Rohan's fall. That promise dies with the wizard's power, near as I can tell." "Don't know," Ghostwriter admitted. "Not really the part I stick around for, usually. I go where the debt calls me. I collect what's owed. I leave the mending to whoever's left standing." He considered the gathered company a moment longer, and something in the set of his burning skull shifted, thoughtful. "But you asked me back at the gate not to leave you with another tyrant wearing a different face. I've been turning that over. Words already moving toward Rohan and toward Fangorn both. The wood knows this is settled, and Eomer's going to carry his own report back to Edoras regardless of what I do next. Between the two of them, I don't figure Isengard gets to just quietly rebuild into whatever it wants to be next, unwatched. You mean to hand us over to Rohan then? One of the Dunlendings said, wary, stepping half a pace forward before Freka's hand on his shoulder held him back. I mean, Ghostwriter said, that what happens next is between you and Rohan, and whatever's left of the man upstairs. Same as any reckoning that actually sticks has to be. I'm not interested in ruling anything. Never have been. I just make sure the ledger's honest when I leave it. He turned the machine, unhurried, back toward the open gate and the churned ground beyond it, where the tear that had first opened above the smoldering stump in Fangorn still hung, quiet and waiting, if one knew exactly where to look. But I'd think hard, Ugluk, about what kind of captain you want to be, now that nobody's compelling the choice for you. That seemed like the one thing you actually got to decide freely, this whole long morning. He did not wait for an answer. Some debts closed clean, with fire and finality. This one, he judged, needed to be left open a while longer. Not his to settle, but theirs, and settling it properly would take longer than a single morning's reckoning could account for. Eomer's company found the aftermath 2 days later, riding cautious toward Isengard's walls at the head of a small delegation sent, at Theoden's uncertain and still recovering direction, to learn the truth behind the wild rumors already spreading across Rohan's borders. A wizard humbled, a garrison in disarray, a burning judge that had walked out of Fangorn and left Isengard's terror broken behind it. He found instead something stranger than either triumph or ruin, a fortress in the slow, halting process of becoming something other than what it had been. Ugluk had not fled, nor had the bulk of the company scattered to banditry, as might have been expected of a leaderless force, suddenly stripped of its commanding purpose. Instead, a rough council had formed. Ugluk himself, Freka speaking for the Dunlending contingent, even Grima, returned from his brief flight, and clearly uncertain of his welcome, offering what knowledge he possessed of the tower's stores and defenses, in exchange for whatever mercy that knowledge might buy him. Saruman himself Eomer found confined to a single modest chamber near the tower's base, stripped of staff and voice both, attended only by a wary guard rotation drawn from the very soldiers who had, days before, stood ready to die defending him. He looked, Eomer thought, studying the diminished old man through the chamber's open door, less like the terror that had haunted Rohan's borders for seasons, and more like what he perhaps truly was beneath all the borrowed power, an old man who had reached too far, for too long, and had finally been made to feel the true weight of every hand he'd reached with. What is to become of him? Eomer asked Ugluk directly, as the two of them stood in the tower's outer yard, taking stock of a fortress in genuine transition. That is not mine to decide alone, Ugluk said, and something in his rough voice carried a gravity Eomer had not expected from an Uruk-hai captain. The spirit left that question open on purpose, I think. Said it was ours to answer, not his. He looked toward the modest chamber where Saruman sat, diminished, alone with whatever reckoning still remained for him to make in private. For my part, I would see him answer to your king, and to whatever court still functions in Rohan and beyond, for the poison poured into Theoden's ear these long seasons. That seems a fairer measure than anything Isengard could render on its own. Eomer considered that a long moment, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, real respect kindling for the rough honesty of it. You could have simply killed him, once the power was gone. Many would not have blamed you. I, Ugluk said, thought on it, in truth, but the spirit made a point of not taking the easy answer, when he might have. Seemed worth learning something from that, even from a creature none of us properly understand. Eomer's gaze drifted, unbidden, toward the northwest, toward the dark line of Fangorn just visible along the horizon, where, if the wilder reports were accurate, the burning judge had returned once more to walk among the wounded trees before whatever door had brought him here finally closed for good. And the spirit himself, Eomer asked, where does he stand now in all this? Gone to the wood, last I heard, Ugluk said. Said he had one more thing to settle with the old trees before he left this world for wherever he came from. Didn't say what. Fangorn had already begun, in the small, quiet way of old and patient things, to heal. Ghost Rider felt it the moment he crossed back into the true forest's shade. Not a dramatic change, nothing so simple as the wounds closing overnight, but a shift in the quality of the air itself, the particular held-breath tension of the last 2 days, finally easing into something closer to cautious relief. The screaming had stopped somewhere in the hours after Isengard's fall. The waiting had stopped with it. He found Treebeard near the same rise where they had first spoken, standing over the smoldering stump where the tear had first opened, though the smolder had gone cold now, and the tear itself had faded to something barely visible, even to eyes built to look for it. "It is done, then," Treebeard said, without turning, some deep root sense apparently having registered his approach long before sight or sound confirmed it. "Mostly," Ghost Rider said, bringing the machine to a halt at the rise's edge. "Wizard's alive, power's gone. What's left of Isengard sorting itself out without him pulling every string." He studied the cold stump a moment, the particular respectful stillness he'd worn since first hearing Treebeard's long telling 2 days before. "Figured I owed you a proper account of how it landed, before I move on. You're the one who called me here after all. Seemed wrong to just vanish without closing the loop." "I did not expect mercy," Treebeard admitted, after a long moment's consideration. "When I first felt the ground tear open above that stump, I expected fire, and an ending, and I confess some part of me, the part still raw from 3 days of listening to trees scream, would have welcomed exactly that, without complaint." He was quiet a moment longer, working through something with the particular unhurried care Ents brought to every difficult thought. "And yet, I find, now that the anger has had 2 days to settle into something calmer, that I do not entirely regret the shape your judgment actually took. A dead wizard changes nothing for the wood already felled. A wizard stripped of the power to fell more, and left to answer for what he already did before those he actually wronged. That, perhaps, is worth more than his simple ending would have been. Wasn't sure myself, until I was standing right in front of him," Ghost Rider admitted. "Usually the ledger's cleaner than this. Guilty thing, guilty deed, fire closes it out. This one had more tangled up in it than most. A whole garrison caught in his orbit. A kingdom's council poisoned through somebody he'd half broken down to nothing. A wood that needed the felling stopped more than it needed the feller dead." He shook his head slightly, an oddly human gesture from something built entirely of bone and fire. Figured stopping the felling mattered more than balancing some abstract scale. "Wood's not going to unburn just because I burned him back. A fair reckoning," Treebeard said, "for a fair mind, whatever else you may be beneath the flame." He looked out over the healing eve, the first green shoots already visible in patches where the sawdust and ash had begun, slowly, to give back to the soil beneath. "It will take a long while yet, this healing. Longer than your kind reckons time, I should think. But it will happen, now that the felling has stopped. That is more than this wood dared hope for." 3 days passed. They stood together a while in companionable silence, the particular stillness of 2 very different but equally patient things taking stock of a debt properly closed. Before Ghost Rider spoke again, something in his tone shifting toward a question that had clearly been sitting with him since the tower. "Your kind, Ents. You've been here a long while, seen things come and go that most of this world's already forgotten." "Longer than most reckonings care to count," Treebeard agreed. "You ever seen anything like what Isengard's about to become? Garrison without a tyrant. Captain trying to figure out if he can actually be something better than what he was bred for. Kingdom's council poisoned and only half cured. Ghost Rider's flame flickered, something almost like genuine curiosity in it. I don't usually stick around to see how the mending goes. Not really built for that part. I have seen kingdoms rise and fall and rise again in stranger shapes than that, Treebeard said. Whether Isengard mends well or mends poorly is not, I think, a thing either of us can properly answer from this rise, watching from a distance. That work belongs now to the ones left standing in it. The captain, the king of Rohan once he is fully himself again, the wizard, should he choose to spend what remains of his days earning back some fraction of what he squandered. He turned his great slow gaze toward Ghost Rider, something almost gentle in the ancient weight of it. You have done your part, spirit. The debt that called you is closed. What grows from the closing is not yours to tend. That, I think, is simply the nature of what you are. Ghost Rider considered that a long moment, the fire in his skull settling into something quieter, more reflective than Treebeard had yet seen from him across their short but eventful acquaintance. Yeah, he said finally. Yes, it is. He turned the machine, unhurried, back toward the deeper wood, toward wherever the fading virgins that had first called him here might still be found waiting. One more stop before I go, though. Told a captain I'd think on what gets left behind, once the fire's done its part. Figured I owed him at least that much honesty, before the door closes. Where will you go, once you have finished thinking on it? Wherever the next debt's waiting, Ghost Rider said simply. There's always another one, somewhere. That's sort of the whole job. He paused at the rise's edge, glancing back once more at the old Ent who had, however unwittingly, first called him into this particular reckoning. Thanks for the telling, old one. Wouldn't have known the whole shape of what I was collecting without it. And thank you, Treebeard said, for listening long enough to actually hear it, before rendering judgment. That is rarer than you might think, in my long experience of this world's dealings. Ghost Rider said nothing further, only inclined the burning skull once in something that might, from a being built otherwise entirely of flame and old purpose, have passed for a genuine gesture of respect, before turning the machine back down the slope, toward Isengard's walls, for one final conversation before the debt truly, fully closed. Uruk was waiting in the outer yard when Ghost Rider returned. Alone, the rest of the company scattered about the fortress in the slow work of taking honest stock of what remained. Stores counted, walls assessed, wounded tended without the particular grim urgency of a garrison still bracing for siege. Thought you might come back, the captain said, by way of greeting. Didn't expect it so soon. Told you I'd think on what to leave behind, Ghost Rider said, bringing the machine to a slow stop in the yard's center. Didn't take as long as I figured. Wasn't really mine to build in the first place. Whatever Isengard becomes next, that's got to be something you all choose. Not something I hand down from a burning skull like it's one more compulsion laid on top of the last one. Uruk considered that, something wry crossing his scarred features. A judge who won't judge the ending. Fair enough, I suppose. Consistent, at least. Here's what I will leave you, Ghost Rider said. Word, and a warning. Both. Rohan's going to come asking questions. Already has, near as I can tell. However this settles, whether it's Theoden's court that ends up with a hand in how Isengard rebuilds, or you lot manage it yourselves, or something in between, don't let it become a second version of the same trap. Compulsion doesn't have to wear a circlet to be compulsion. Fear dressed up as necessity got you here once already. The flame in his skull steadied. Something almost like genuine hope threaded strangely through the gravel of his voice. You said you don't break. Make sure that holds true even when nobody's forcing the question anymore. That's harder than it sounds in my experience. Plenty of things only find out what they're really made of once the compulsion's gone, and the choosing's genuinely free. And the wizard? Not mine to sentence twice, Ghost Rider said. He'll answer to Rohan, to whoever else he's wronged badly enough to want a proper accounting. That's how it should go. My part of it's closed. He turned the machine, unhurried, toward the open gate and the pale afternoon light beyond it, where the fading edges of the vergence that had first carried him into this world sat waiting, thin and patient, in the shadow of Fangorn's eastern eve. Debts paid, Captain. Not by my choosing alone, by yours too, and Frika's, and Wormtongue's honest accounting on the stair, and every soldier along that wall who set their bow down rather than keep aiming it. That's what actually closed this one out. Fire just finished what all of you had already started. He did not wait for a further reply, though he felt, at his back, the particular weighted silence of a soldier turning something over that would likely occupy him for a long while yet. The strange, unfamiliar shape of a freedom he had not chosen and did not yet fully know what to do with. The ride back to Fangorn's Eve was quiet, the churned battlefield already beginning, in small ways, to give back its silence to the wind. Treebeard was waiting at the tier's fading edge when he arrived, along with Quickbeam, both Ents standing in the particular patient stillness of things that had learned, across long ages, exactly how to witness an ending properly. It's closing, Treebeard observed, nodding toward the thin seam of orange-white light, still visible, barely, in the afternoon air above the cold stump. The wood's grief has found its answer. I do not think it will tear open again, not for a long while yet, if the healing holds as it has begun. Good, Ghost Rider said. Means I did the job right. He paused at the tier's edge, the machine idling low and patient beneath him, and looked back once, over the ravaged but healing ground, toward the black tower still standing distant against the pale sky. Diminished now, but standing, and in its diminishment, perhaps finally capable of becoming something other than what it had been. This wasn't the cleanest debt I've ever collected. Usually it's simpler. Guilty thing, guilty deed, fire closes it. This one had a whole kingdom's worth of tangled threads underneath it. The flame in his skull flickered, something almost like satisfaction in it, hard-won and unshowy. Figured out somewhere along the way that clean isn't always the same thing as right. A hard lesson, Treebeard said, and a true one. This old wood is glad, in the end, that it was you who answered its call, rather than some simpler judgment that knew only fire and no mercy worth the name. Don't get used to the mercy, Ghost Rider said, though there was no real edge in it. Not every debt looks like this one. Some of them just burn, clean through, and that's the whole of what's owed. He turned the machine fully toward the waiting tier, its edges pulsing faint and patient, ready. But this one needed more than burning. Glad I took the time to see that, before the fire had the final word. He rode forward, unhurried as he had been in every moment since first stepping onto that smoldering stump 3 days before, and the tier opened wide to receive him, orange-white light spilling once more across the healing clearing, and then, quiet, complete, the debt fully closed. He was gone, the seam sealing shut behind him with a soft sound like a held breath finally released. Treebeard and Quickbeam stood a long while at the closed door, watching the last embers of light fade from the air, before the old Ent finally turned his great slow gaze back toward the healing wood behind them. Come, he said. There is much mending still to be done, and we have, I think, finally been given the room to properly begin it. The wood healed slowly, the way old and deeply wounded things always do. Not in a season, not even in several, but in the patient, unhurried accumulation of years that Ents alone among Middle-earth's peoples had the true temperament to properly witness. New growth crept back across the clear-cut ground first as scattered green shoots pushing up through ash and sawdust, then as saplings, then, decades on, as young trees tall enough to remember, in whatever way trees remembered anything, that the ground beneath them had once screamed. Isengard became, in the turning years that followed, neither the tyranny it had been, nor quite the ruin some had expected in its place. Uruk held the yard through the uncertain early seasons, answering hard questions from Rohan's riders, and harder ones from his own uneasy conscience. And if he never became a figure the old songs would sing of, he became, by slow and deliberate choosing, something no one watching that first grim morning would have predicted. A captain who would not break, holding a fortress toward something other than conquest. Saruman lived out his diminished years under a watch that was never quite forgiveness, and never quite cruelty either, answering, imperfectly, incompletely, as men who have been made to truly see themselves, so rarely manage anything but imperfectly, for a debt whose full accounting would outlast him. Eomer carried his own report to Edoras, and though it would take further seasons and harder truths, yet to fully clear the poison from Theoden's court, the seed of that clearing had been planted on a morning when a burning stranger had named a rot the king's own kin had long suspected but never quite proven. And somewhere beyond the reach of any world's reckoning, in whatever quiet or restless place waited between one debt and the next, a spirit built only to punish carried forward, into whatever ground called him next, a small and hard-won lesson that Fangorn's ancient patience had taught him, that the fire always finished what it was called to finish, but that the truest justice, sometimes, asked more of him than simply burning, asked him to see, clearly and completely, before he decided exactly what needed to be paid, and what, against every simpler instinct, deserved instead the harder mercy of being left to mend. The wood remembered, the wood healed, and somewhere in the space between those two long truths, the debt that had once torn the world's fabric wide enough to let him through finally, fully, closed.